One of the many ways in which we don't keep up with the times is in adjusting our self image. My image of myself has always been that of a creator, though I would not have used that word creator when I was younger. I thought of myself as someone who would write books one day. When I fell in love with cinema as a kid, I thought I would make movies one day. But then in my early teens, I chose between the two. I decided that writing books was easier as it didn't involve other people. But here's the thing, if I was born 30 years after I was actually born, these might not be the outlets I would aspire to. We are surrounded today by so many other ways to express ourselves, to tell stories, to connect with others. Maybe I'd want to be a YouTuber. Maybe I'd dream of being a showrunner for a web series. Maybe I'd want to be the Picasso of Instagram or the Shakespeare of stand-up comedy. And hey, who knows? Maybe I'd want to be a podcaster?
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Verma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Varun Dugirala, a creator and podcaster whose personal journey feels quite different from mine, partly because he's almost a decade younger, but who has recently been trying to figure out the exact things that I've been obsessing about. First, let me give you a bit of his bare bones bio. Varun did engineering, then he did mass comm, then he worked for a while as a producer in MTV and Channel V, then he started his own advertising agency, The Glitch, which was acquired a couple of years ago by the global giant WPP. He also runs a podcast called Advertising is Dead and has a newsletter called Unschooled, as well as a YouTube show called The Varun Duggi Show, in which I was a recent guest. Now, what is the common obsession here? It's understanding how the world has changed for creators. You could say that by joining music television, Varun jumped in at the deep end at the end of the old world. And then when he struck off on his own in 2009, a new world was forming. Now, here are the salient points of this new world, which is still evolving. One, anyone can be a creator. You don't need fancy training and expensive equipment and the backing of a big platform to create stuff. A smartphone is enough. Two, the relationship between creators and their audiences has gradually become more intimate with less need of a platform in between. And this has threatened advertising as well, which is a pertinent point given that Varun for more than a decade has been a creator working in the advertising business. And three, these new ways of how we connect with our audiences have changed not just the way we create, but also who we are. I've said time and again on this show that learning the art of long conversations changed who I am as a person. In this episode, Varun echoes that sentiment. I enjoy chatting with him because I think, like with most successful creators in this new world, what you see is what you get. Varun is straightforward, curious, humble about what he does not know, hungry to know more, and always thinking about the world, getting meta, as it were. So I enjoyed this conversation that goes over many of these areas, but I have to warn you that it doesn't touch the emotional depths of the last couple of episodes I did with Ghazala Wahab and Prem Panikkar. This conversation won't make you cry, but it can make you think. And what's not to like about that? Before we begin though, let's take a quick commercial break, which, because I don't actually have a sponsor for this episode, is actually about my own writing course. Why don't you sign up? Have you always wanted to be a writer but never quite gotten down to it? Well, I'd love to help you. One of the great joys of the lockdown for me was discovering how much I enjoy teaching what I've learned over the years. And my online course, The Art of Clear Writing, is now open for registration. In this course, through 4 webinars spread over 4 weekends, I share all I know about the craft and practice of clear writing. There are many exercises, much interaction, and over the year that I've taught this course, a lively writing community has formed itself. The course costs Rs 10,000 plus GST or about $150, and the April classes begin on April 3rd. So if you're interested, head on over to register at indiauncut.com/clearwriting. That's indiauncut.com/clearwriting. Being a good writer doesn't require God-given talent, just the willingness to work hard and a clear idea of what you need to do to refine your skills. I can help you. Varun, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this one.
Yeah, I mean, I have, of course, just been on your show, The Varun Duggi Show, which was fun. And also, of course, you have your long-running podcast, Advertising is Dead. And, when I was kind of researching for the show, for this episode, I came across this quote by yours about how you don't do any prep. Like you switch on 15 minutes before you're recording and you switch off 10 minutes afterwards. And
Yeah.
my process is somewhat different. So I thought this is almost like, Tendulkar and Dravid together in the popular stereotypes that it's effortless for one and so much effort for the other. Though obviously, like I keep telling people about Tendulkar and Dravid, that the stereotype is completely false because Tendulkar also put in a heck of a lot of work and Dravid also had immense natural talent. So it's an unfortunate stereotype. But to come away from those particular superstars to you, tell me a little bit about your early years. Like what is intriguing about you is that, if one just sees the image of Varun Dugirala, co-founder of The Glitch, content creator, productivity guru, all of those things, a podcaster, you get the image of a guy who's like full-on hipster type, would be at home in Bandra, but you actually grew up in Kokinada in Andhra Pradesh. So tell me a little bit about that. What was that like growing up in Kokinada?
So it's interesting you said Kokinada, right? So Kokinada was its original name, and then it eventually became Kakinada when I was growing up. I always thought it's cool to call it Kokanada. When you're young and you think, okay, one second, where do you come from? Kokanada, right? But yeah. So interesting, right? I grew up in Kakinada. Just for everyone, is coast of Andhra Pradesh, East Godavari district. And a large part of family is there. I mean, everyone grew up there. So standard South Indian Telugu Brahmin family. Everybody is either a doctor or an engineer. The doctors stay back home. Engineers go to America. Literally, like the standard template is my family. So you will find a large part of my engineering family in San Francisco, in Boston. The regular spots as such. And my family back home was a multi-specialty hospital. I didn't know you had to pay for medical treatment as much as you did for the longest part, because every specialization there was some uncle or there was somebody there, right? So that's how I grew up. I actually grew up in a hospital. My dad's a surgeon. My grandmom, even though she practiced as a gynac, was an MBBS, but because she became a doctor when she did, she had basically delivered generations in families and stuff like that. So I grew up on the first floor of a hospital, had walked into an operation theater from the youngest of ages with a mask and a cap and watched operations, fainted in one of those, and then I realized I will never be a doctor because I just couldn't deal with it. And but it was great. I mean, I think I grew up at an interesting time there as well, because I think my parents were not the traditional kinds. I grew up with my dad and mom listening to Pink Floyd and Deep Purple and Michael Bolton on the other end of things, and they had me when they were very young. They were in the early 20s when they had me, so they kind of grew up together. Dad was still studying, mom was still also studying, and Kakinada is a great place because I had a good set of friends. I'd play, but I also had got my own space. And in hindsight, I mean, I think a lot of how my mind works still originates from a lot of stuff I learned as a kid over there. But yeah, it feels like a different world.
Yeah, and once in not even a one-liner, in a half-liner, you sort of spoke about your Kakinada years as being full of Chiranjeevi and Michael Jackson. But one thing, that I'm really kind of curious about and that I ask all of my guests at different ages, whether they're in their 50s, 60s, 40s like me or 30s or whatever, is, and I feel it also gives me a great sense of what it was like to grow up at that time in India. Tell me the years of your childhood and what kind of stuff were you consuming? Like, how much did you get to read? What was your access to books like? What kind of music did you listen to? Like, I remember when I was growing up in the 80s and the 90s, it was all the, the stereotypical music, like you named Pink Floyd, and there will be the Deep Purples and all of that. And you had to make an effort to look beyond that. The world was not at your fingertips, as it were. So what were your sort of early influences in terms of, music, films, books? What was that like for you?
So, I actually had a lot of access to both music and books growing up. Mom and dad read a lot, still do. So I had access to a wide spread of books, right? So, and they almost like push me to read more, primarily because I felt it's a good thing to do. You kind of get to know more about the world if you read. And that's what I ended up doing. So on one end, you would have your standard, you'd have your Enid Blyton, I keep pronouncing her last name wrong. Or on the other end, you would also end up getting books, which, so I was a huge, I have to admit this. I spent the first 3 years of my life watching the same movie, which was Jungle Book. Because I would walk across the street, there would be a video lending library, which was a thing. And they only had like this one tape for kids. Everything else was Telugu movies or a couple of stuff from abroad. I just picked this up and they would like just keep it because I would go every day, watch it, return it, and then again go back the next day. And they were like, just like a couple of houses away. So growing up, I say I'm a weird mixture of being very extroverted, but yet extremely a person with a need to kind of have time to himself. I was that as a kid. Like I would go out and play, but I wanted to come back into my room and play with my GI Joes and play with a lot of Lego. And growing up at that time, it was a lot about playing with toys by myself. I had a lot of friends across the street who do the standard stuff, but it was an interesting time because I love music from the time I was a kid. There's this story my mother tells that I would dance to water splashing in the bathroom. Right, I was that kid. I would go for breakdancing competitions from the time it was allowed for me to go in terms of just an age limit. And you would go to an audio cassette shop, and all you would find was Michael Jackson and Madonna, and a few others, or once in a while a Bruce Springsteen would pop in, and that's pretty much what you had available. And I watched a lot of Telugu movies. Like Chiranjeevi was a huge influence at that time for most of us. I think I saw his Thriller version before I saw the actual Thriller version of Michael Jackson. So I grew up that way, but I feel it was an interesting mix of things because my parents were people who were very exposed to the world outside. So at home I would still have you'd have a Michael J. Fox movie playing on one end, or you'd have I remember there was a book. There was Khalil Gibran's book, which used to be there, or you would find such varied things at home, and you wouldn't understand when you suddenly left the house. You see a lot of people who weren't necessarily into a lot of that stuff. So my parents kind of balanced it. I think I learned to balance it as well, and eventually, same for my sister as well. Many years later, but it was an interesting time, and they had a group of friends who I grew up with, and so this is a close group I kind of grew along with. So yeah, I actually got a lot of my music influences from my parents. What they would listen to, I would listen to. There was a lot of Beatles at home. There was the standard, Deep Purple, Pink Floyd, etc. My uncle, my mom's younger brother, actually became an interesting influence for me because I had moved towards listening to a lot of pop and stuff like that. Like he came home and he saw, I think he saw me listening to Backstreet Boys, and he was like, "This, there is no way you're going down this route." And gave me a Marilyn Manson and a Nine Inch Nails CD. My life changed after that. Mother was not happy because I used to play Doom at that point of time and listen to Marilyn Manson. And at that point of time in America, a lot of the school shootings had happened with people who were listening to this and playing that game, right? So, and I was like, I know you're worried about it. That's not what I'm going to do. And so I feel a lot of, and then my journey with music's been interesting. It's one of the things I obsess over so much. I listen to so much music through every single genre. So that was like a huge point, which has also kind of led me to being this person obsessed with music television. Like I would only watch Channel V and MTV in the 90s. Before that, for people who remember it, every Saturday or Sunday, DD Metro would have a compilation of music videos that would come. Top of the Pops, I think it was called. I don't remember the exact name. There was an interesting name to it. So I used to record those on a tape and rewatch them. So Careless Whisper. I remember there were a bunch of those videos at that point of time. Tracy Chapman. And I would start. I used to love the music video as a form. It was something which really appealed to me. And the dream was that in life I want to do something with MTV in life. I didn't know what it was, but I think that it originated there and eventually did happen years later. So one tick off the box happened. But my influences are very varied in that sense. Like, so I would be guilty boy when you come out of the house. 2 buttons of the shirt kind of get loosened up. You go hang with the boys, talk about Chiranjeevi, do all of that stuff. But when you're back home, I kind of also get my own space to be myself. So it was an interesting time growing up.
From that period, what's your comfort food? Like, not just in terms of food, but are there songs you keep going back to? Are there movies you keep going back to? Books you reread?
So I'm actually a hardcore Massy Bollywood buff. Tridev is still one of my all-time favorite movies. I still go back to it when I need to find something to watch. Andaz Apna Apna, etc. were obviously always there, but I think Tridevi is something I don't know why I keep going back to it. Mithun movies, Dance, Disco Dance, that kind of cinema somehow appealed to me, and it still does. There was something so interesting about it. I think they had characters, right? And for me, what I used to enjoy about those were not the main guys. You'd have just two guys around Amrish Puri, or you'd have those other characters. For me, was so amazing. I miss them in movies now. So I used to do a lot of that. That though I go back to that. Yeah, I still eat pickle with every single meal that I can. So pickle is my comfort food. I through the pandemic, because my mom couldn't ship me some, I eventually found someone who can ship it off Amazon, and I got it. So food wise, I'm pretty straightforward. I enjoy all kinds of food, but if I'm eating by myself, you still old school, right? You need to have some pickle if you're guilty. And but yeah, so I still go back to some of those things. Also got a lot into science fiction at that point of time as well. So Orson Scott Card was a huge influence in terms of his books, not necessarily his political views later on, but as I learned. But he wrote a series called the Ender series, which kind of really stuck with me, right? And what I loved about that is he wrote a series with one character, and then he went back and he wrote the same story from the perspective of different characters, which I found so interesting for an author to actually do in science fiction and fantasy. So yeah, so varied influences, varied directions, as you can see.
Yeah, fascinating. And you mentioned that your parents had you early, they were in their early 20s. And, just today in my writing group, someone shared one of my favorite poems by Philip Larkin, where the first verse effectively is, they F you up your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. And then it kind of goes on. What were they like as parents? Were you a rebellious kid? What kind of kid were you? When you look back in hindsight, like now you're a parent yourself, and I'm presuming you became a parent a little later with a little more reflection and all of that. So, what was it like growing up? Because, in a sense, I think young parents, when they have their first kid, they are growing up at the same time as a kid, which is, kind of interesting and something that you might only see in hindsight. What was that like?
So I actually have a very interesting relationship with my parents, right? Because like you rightly said, we grew up together in many ways. They were learning things as at the time when they were very young. But I think that what I had in many ways was we were a very close knit unit. We were always together. We were doing stuff. I remember when I did my kindergarten in Manipal because my dad was doing his masters in surgery there, and I spent a large amount of time there because me and my mom would generally just like roam around and do stuff. I mean, I didn't have school, and you'd explore places. You kind of go somewhere, and me and my mom on her I think it was a Luna, would kind of go around, and I think that's what made it interesting for I think for all three of us because we kind of got I feel that you have a lot more moments when you're not watching something or not doing something, and I feel we had a lot more moments nowadays, obviously, which is what I still try to do as a parent now. I still try to retain that a lot more, and eventually when you kind of got back, obviously everybody gets into their work and everything else. But for me, those early years were very interesting, and whichever part I recollect, because I feel that they were trying to get to a point of actually doing something in life while I was still trying to figure out what I mean. You're in kindergarten, you don't know anything, right? So, and I was a reasonably naughty kid. I would not be. So they'd be having breakfast and get a call from school that I've cut my tongue by jumping around with my tongue out. So I had to get surgery on my tongue to stitch it up because my tongue was flopping out and I'd just done something, and or like fallen off a Luna somewhere and some stones gone into my knee. So I don't think I was troublesome, but I would get into trouble a lot. I've always been good at avoiding being caught. It has been the long-standing trend to a large part of my schooling years is that I would be involved in the planning of things. I would be involved in the execution of a prank or something to do, but most times would not get caught. And I kind of see that trait in Leia as well. So I at some point I call her out on some of those things. I know what you're doing. I've done that. So for a 3.5-year-old, she looks at me and says, "Okay, fair enough. You got me there." But I think that it was great fun growing up with them being so young as well because I got to see parties as I was growing up. I got to see them being young. So Those are my oldest remembrance, recollections of both of them, which is great.
That's fascinating. And what was it like growing up in a small town? Like, how long were you there? And also, I guess a small town can affect you in two ways. One is that it can give you a certain sense of confidence because back in the day, you don't really know the big bad world out there. So, you can be comfortable in your skin and all those other anxieties that might come in when you're in a big city, when you feel you're being judged, where all those other pressures aren't really there. But at the same time, what's your view of the world? In the sense, your view of the world, even given that, you're in a home of some privilege, there's exposure to books and music and all of that, but even all of that is kind of limited. So what's your view of the world at that time? And when you look back on, the small town what strikes you?
Um, the interesting part is there is an interesting flip, right? And you mentioned it in the right way. When you're in a small town and you do reasonably well at things, I was an average, sometimes above average student, right? I was one of those guys you go to PT meeting saying he has so much potential. I was that kid, but I'd still be like house captain easily. I would win a swimming competition because there were 5 kids who would swim, right? And so there was things where you, in hindsight, you think about and you're like, so I would hustle my way into being every single sports team, very bad at sport in general. And so I don't think I was overconfident, but I was in Kakinada with a certain sense of confidence that, I was among the top set of people, right? Um, Not necessarily studies, because obviously, and this, I have a huge issue with education and systems in general, because I feel they're built for almost like a supply chain system of getting people out with the same sort of mindsets. So I wasn't necessarily those guys who would get like 95%, 96%, right? I ended up in my 10th standard with like an 88%, which in hindsight is not bad. But it wasn't necessarily like you didn't get above 90%, right? So a lot of people would be like that. My parents didn't necessarily care as much. They were like, 88 is good enough. And so, but after that, when I actually went to Bangalore for my 11th and 12th, and that actually was an interesting story, is that I actually joined junior college in Kakinada. I took the standard route. All my friends were joining a couple of those colleges to study to become engineers. I said, okay, I don't want to be a doctor. My logic was it takes X number of years to study to be an engineer, X number of years study to be a doctor. Engineering is much lower. Let's do that. I also still love to code. Coding was a love of mine because I discovered computers, and I still remember that first dial-up modem that came in, trying to open that website at night. Opening a website at night was for obvious reasons, because you could also discover things which you're not allowed to watch when parents were awake. And so I was obsessed with that. So I learned early programming language like Basic and C++ and stuff like that. And I still do a lot of that. And I joined this college, which is supposed to prepare you for engineering entrance and all that stuff. And the culture shock, weirdly enough, even though I was in school in Kakinada, was immense, because it was a factory outlet to create people who would get into engineering college. And it would almost be a scenario where you'd be in college from 7 in the morning till like 7 at night. You were pushed to study Sanskrit as your language, because Sanskrit you can actually get almost 100 out of 100, because all the questions come from the textbook. So it was almost you're mugging up the entire textbook, so you could actually get that. You can get that higher percentile. And there's a reason why I feel that we have a factory outlet of engineers coming out, because we're not necessarily bringing out creative engineers, right? I really related to. I know everyone talks about Three Idiots, but when I saw that, and I saw, I think Chichore, right, which is the Sushant one, I related to those more from those times as much as I did to my engineering years, because that is the truth. That is what happens. And my uncle had come down to get a procedure done. One of my dad's friends had come down to get a procedure done with my dad, and he's like, "What are you doing here?" And I'm like, "I'm doing this." It's like, you are a person who should not be here. And he said, "Let me take you to my school." And he was from a school called Bishop Wharton's in Bangalore. Boarding school, been around for years and years and years, and some amount of heritage, etc. So he took me there, somehow managed to get me. So me, my dad, and him drove down, sat there. Dad and he figured out how to get me admission. I don't know what they did. They got me in, because term had started. It'd been a few weeks, but he was an ex-student, and he kind of pulled a few pieces there. But once I got in and I had to go to a hostel, very nice boarding school, the flip that happened in my life is whatever I perceived as cool whatever I perceived as a confidence building thing for me back in Kakinada suddenly became a big negative for me. Because you would watch a movie, let's say I watch Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, and this is a fact, and you find him wearing a neon color t-shirt, you would buy a neon color t-shirt. I had that cool chain that Shah Rukh wore, right? Which is not cool at all in hindsight to wear, and I was told it was not cool. So I believe those 2 years in boarding school, although I made some great friends, some of them who I still kind of chat with them we all reunited on a WhatsApp group recently, which is fun. I feel those couple of years really pushed me down in terms of just generally what my confidence level was. So I retreated. I was this kid who would get onto stage to do anything, would do anything. And I finally become this guy who was very averse to, I wanted to prove that I was cool. So I would do stuff like, bunking out at night or go out and get biryani for the entire dorm because, and not like I was paying for it. I would be the guy who do those things just to almost get some sort of approval. And I feel a lot of people go through that. So years later, when I was asked to do my first TEDx talk, and it was in the engineering college in Kakinada, what I actually spoke about was the small town mindset, right? I spoke about that because I believe a lot of guys go through that. A lot of people come from a small town with an immense chip on their shoulder that I'm somehow less aware, no lesser. I'm not where all these other guys are in everything, apart from maybe marks. And I did that primarily because I felt that through my years in Bangalore. My parents call those the dark ages of my time. I had a lot of fun. I have a lot of friends from my Bangalore time, but it was not the nicest time in my own headspace in where I was.
Yeah, and that's like a fascinating transition you spoke about how you sort of land up in Bishop's Cotton in Bangalore, and all these other imperatives come into play where what was once cool is not cool. So you got to prove you're cool, and you're, signaling in different ways. And that reminded me of something Jonathan Haidt recently said. Like, I produce a podcast called Brave New World, which is hosted by Vasandhar, and he did an episode with Jonathan Haidt where he was talking about what social media has done over the last 10 years, essentially. And apparently for boys, it's not been a problem because they spend a lot of time playing video games and all of that, and it builds up skills and it doesn't really hurt them. For girls, it's been devastating and has led to a rise in teenage depression and all of that. And I think what girls go through seems to be similar to what you said you went through, in the sense that you are suddenly on this platform where everyone is performing all the time. All the other 9-year-old girls, if you're a 9-year-old girl, are brand managers of themselves, where they're putting a particular face forward. And if you want to belong, that's what you do. And back in the day, before social media, maybe you hang out in person together and you build bonds that way. But over here, everything is performative. There are all these anxieties and pressures. And at a larger societal level, it seems to me, just thinking aloud, to be an analog of what you went through when you, went from a small town into the big bad world. And that seems to be happening to kids everywhere all the time. I mean, is that something that's kind of struck you as well?
Yeah, definitely has, right? Because this need for acceptance is so high. And you also have different kinds. And I feel that that's it. I knew there were people in my batch, if I go back to boarding school, who didn't necessarily care. There would be one set of people who were generally the guys who just came in to study, stay in the dorm, go do what they want to do. Then there were the cool kids, right? There were some of them who've been around boarding for a long time. Some of them who were good at sport, or the guys who became prefects or head, all those things. I became a prefect at some point. Also was stripped of it for a reason which I'll get into. And so there were all of those. And at some point, you want to be friends with the cool ones. And I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong about what was going. You have your regular stuff that happens, and there's a little bit of pulling of the leg and stuff. But I feel that for some people who kind of stuck in between, which is what I was, I didn't want to be the person who was not hanging around with everyone. But I knew I wasn't cool enough because I didn't play football. My taste in music at that point, while I still had a few of these Marilyn Mansons and Nine Inch Nails and stuff like that, I was still also did have a Backstreet Boys CD because I still like listening to Backstreet Boys. So, you don't listen to Guns N' Roses happened, or I discovered Weezer and I discovered Green Day, and so people had progressed beyond some of the stuff I listened to because I didn't have access to them, and so that became a thing. And you slowly make friends, but I feel that boarding school more than anything else, which I don't think it's going to be the same now because of cell phones and everything else. Boarding school taught you that you'd meet so many different characters from across the world. It's almost like a mini social network where you kind of put into, and you don't know what anyone's thinking, because I don't think anyone's coming in with bad intentions. Everyone has their own thought processes, and you learn how to navigate life a lot more. And I learned a lot of that in 2 years. But in trying to do that, you would do stuff like, jump off the gate and go and watch Fir Bhi Dil Hai Hindustani of all movies and get caught, get stripped of your prefectship, kicked out of boarding, live in a friend's house, take money from home and not necessarily spend it right, and use it more for partying and other things, and not spend it on food. And I remember that there was a time when I told my mother, and I knew that she was really upset about it, that I was spending change to eat bananas as food, but spending all the money on going out to party and have a drink and all that stuff, right? Um, and in hindsight, really stupid things, but I feel doing stupid things in life teach you later on. And I think I've learned a lot from it, especially those years when I look back at those.
And it also kind of strikes me, and I'm thinking aloud, that in certain ways, ambition can be a drawback, in the sense that you spoke about kids in your boarding school who are not ambitious in a sense of needing to fit in. So they can just chill out, they can study, they can do whatever, they can listen to Backstreet Boys. But if you are ambitious and you want to get ahead in the world and you want to fit in, then you start kind of doing things to fit in. And it can especially be a con, it strikes me, in the modern world where, we grew up where our early thoughts are not captured for posterity, right? Because there's no Twitter, there's no Facebook. Yeah. We are not the kind of garbage that we thought and said. Like, I know I thought and said, I'm sure you must have as well, because young people do, right? And it's not out there. Nobody's, taking a screenshot, putting it out there. And with young people, it seems to me that there is this pressure to be performative, to kind of enter that race. And once you have, it can harden who you are. Because I think what happens is that, if I have a bunch of private thoughts and I don't articulate them, it's that much more likely for me to change my mind, to learn as things go on. But once I take public positions, then because of reasons of ego, I can feel compelled to double down and defend the positions I have taken. And then I can harden. And that alone can just make me a completely different person from what I, otherwise would have been. And again, I'm just thinking aloud, but do you think there's something to that? And, how much of sort of happenstance do you ascribe to your becoming the person you are? Because, all these little things that happen in our lives can just shape us and take us in directions which change us completely. For example, what if you hadn't gone to Bishop Cotton School? Yeah. What if you'd stayed in your engineering factory in Kokinada? Or what if, the directions that we'll discuss that you took after this, where you got into communication and all that and shifted from that path? What if all that hadn't happened?
No, I totally agree. I think that there are moments in your life which define who you become. One moment for me was definitely coming, and because also it was weird that my parents actually sent me, because when I was in my 4th standard, they took me to another boarding school in Ooty, and I came back in 3 days. I literally went with my dad and came back with my dad, saying I don't want to do this. Basically cried and came back with him. But that would be one strong moment. I feel another moment would be right after my 12th standard, around that time. Now, here's where I think some things were just meant to be, right? Everybody's supposed to write for IIT. I don't think there's any chance I would have gotten into IIT. IIT pre-exams were on 2nd of Jan 2000. Now, for anybody, I'm just trying to think of the person who decided that would be the day for an IIT exam to happen. It is the millennium. It is it is a day after New Year's Eve. And I knew so many people who were sitting and studying. I didn't. I literally, I didn't even give the exam. And I remember telling my parents that I'm going to, but I just didn't. And I was anyway on a downward spiral in life. And then that led me to not preparing properly for engineering entrance exams, didn't get into it. Then you start escaping the reality that you are on a downward spiral, right? And I went on that route for a long time, because what happens is that I feel the difference is that at that point in time, you would hide stuff for fear of what your parents or what society would think. But we would hide lesser things. So a lot of stuff you would do was not entirely documented online, like you said. But I think the realm of what all you hide, like I know that sometimes I kind of go back to some old posts on Instagram or on Facebook and think, okay, was there stuff I would say in the past? Because I didn't know it was kosher or not, right? And I agree. There were terms we used, there were jokes we made, there was general behavior trends, because I don't think people, I think there are two kinds. You either don't know any better because everybody else is doing it, or you know it and you willfully do it. And I feel a vast majority, even maybe even now, don't know any better. They don't understand the concept of many other things and why something is wrong. And I feel that was obviously much larger then, but it's not like it's gone away even now. I still meet many people who don't understand. I remember meeting someone in Bombay when the Me Too movement was happening, and he was like, "Ye Me Too sab hota hai kya?" Right? Because I don't think I think he was oblivious of it. I don't think he really meant it as to say, okay, do these things really happen? I think he really meant it in terms of, is it actually such a big thing that it hasn't, more than disbelief, it was more like, really, is it such a big thing? So and I found that interesting, and I take those parallels back in life through many things, right? And you would look at even something as small as what it meant to kind of get into a place on merit, which I never knew. I'd gotten into bishops through my uncle. I eventually got into engineering college again through another dad's friend, because management quota had to happen. So he figured a college which was good in Bangalore. Management quota, dad outside to pay money, gonna got in. And that was again one more downward spiral in life, right? Didn't do well, kept flunking papers, managed to scrape through a 4-year degree in 6 years. But yeah, so I feel that period I look back at a lot, many times, sometimes, especially when I want to write something down. Whenever I try to write a book, I always go back to those years, because I feel like in hindsight, I learned so much from those years than I did at that point of time.
And in one of the earlier episodes of Advertising is Dead, in fact, the most charming episode in my little opinion, the Valentine's episode where your wife sort of chats with you, Pooja, and at one point she, I think, used this phrase about you, which I found fascinating, which is she said that you're in a quote deep relationship with yourself, stop quote, and I was kind of struck by that, and I've been sort of thinking about how we construct our sense of the self in recent years, and it strikes me that it is all so contingent, in the sense that we are hardwired in a certain way and that's an accident, and then we are born where we are in the circumstances and families, and that's also an accident, and then we go through life and all these different accidents happen to us, and in the end we end up as whoever we are at that point in time, but which is, to me, it seems almost entirely a product of accidents. And for someone given to this, the kind of self-reflection you've done in your podcasts and in your newsletter and all of that, what do you think of that? Like, do you think that if there is, like, who is Varun really? Like, it's easy to say that, okay, we are a product of all these different things happening to us, but let's say that other things happen. Is there a constant Varun who is at the center of it all through this, or do circumstances change you? Does a chemical imbalance in your head, which, a different set of things happen, does that change you? There are people who will get a brain tumor and they'll go and do mass shootings because something has changed in a subtle way.
Yeah.
So is there a core Varun in there, or, like me, do you also sometimes feel that you're kind of floating, that, who am I, sort of?
The floating happens all the time. But there is something I've realized, especially in a weird way, after I started the podcast, right? I've always tried to play the role which I felt I needed to post my Bangalore years, because I went through the engineering phase, didn't even apply for a job in engineering because I didn't want to do it. Did a call center stint where I worked for AOL cancellations for about, I think it feels like a year, but I think it was 4 to 6 months. Worked for Jack Daniel's whiskey and a few others as a alcohol promoter. When I went to Pune, I took a call for myself, because and I feel that's which it adds back to everything which I am at this moment, is that when I got into Symbiosis in Pune, I'd actually gotten it through merit, and I got into merit also through a bit of a fluke. So that's one more crucial point in my life. Is my mother's was, I don't know if she still is, but I should ask her, was a Reader's Digest reader for the longest time, subscriber. I'd always have that at home, and my mom would always be reading it. The Symbiosis entrance piece application form came in a Reader's Digest edition, sends it to me in Bangalore while I was working in the call center, said, you always wanted to work in the media, why don't you just apply? And because I was doing the job of a promoter as well, I'd applied to it saying I want to study PR, because I thought the same thing. I didn't know any better. quit my job, went back home, didn't study, just like lied around on the couch and watched MTV for those few months. And then when I went back to Bangalore to give that exam, I remember I went back to Bangalore, got a haircut, met a friend after a long time, had drank all night, and went for the exam in the morning. Answered English, answered general knowledge, and walked out. Didn't answer stat, didn't answer math, none of those things. Because in my head, I was like, if it's for mass comm, why do they need these sections? It was common for a lot of it was a random punt. I was still not serious in life, right? I still had a job and I was still figuring it out. So and I got in. I got in the first list. I remember when I got in the first list, I didn't believe it. I didn't even check. Someone checked and called me, and I cut the call because I was asleep at 2 in the afternoon. And I think at that point I'm like, okay, this is finally you're getting a chance in life to prove something through merit, something you always wanted to do. So when I went to Pune, I said, it's not like I will suddenly become this saint, but if I don't focus now, there is no point. And so I became this person who knew I had a role to play. And my role was, okay, during this time, I need to learn as much as I can about this space that I've always been so fascinated by, that I can get a career here. Where do you want to work? Channel V, MTV, literally 2 places I wanted to work. Went to internet, MTV, did all of that. Through my reality show period, focused on being a producer, because that's what I wanted to be. Through the period at Glitch, it was about being the right kind of, I don't think entrepreneur, but just being that person who was around to make sure enough support was there. The podcast actually let me suddenly be myself again after a long time, out in the open, which I never was. I'd still hold back, right? I was always the guy who, even at Glitch, who would not go out and have a lot of if everyone's kind of going out for a drink, I would not go beyond the first drink and I would leave, because I'm like, I still have to have that relationship where you can turn to me when you need something, not someone who's always hanging out with you, even though I might want to. So some of the early guys who I crossed that with very early on, but with the podcast, I realized that now I'm so open I'm like an open book. I talk about everything in my life. People are like, why are you so open about things? I'm like, I finally have come to a point in life where I'm like, all the stuff I've been interested in, all the stuff I like to do, even though some of them might be really weird, it's fine. That's what makes me who I am. And the more I speak about it with that tone, if there is a young kid from another small town listening to me in a small way, and I feel like I want to give back to that kid that I was, who was a lot of fun when he was growing up in Kokinada, had a lot of confidence of all the stuff that he was interested in. Like I was a kid who would jump off a stool for a breakdancing competition, and jump onto stage and try and do a Prabhudeva move, right? And I went from that to being a person who was just very happy to be at the back and not really be in the forefront of things. So I agree that what we are as kids is the purest form of what we are. But I feel at some point when you reach a certain point in life, you kind of go back to that if you're lucky, and get to have a slightly more mature version of that kid.
That's kind of fascinating. And I like last week I read an episode with Prem Panikar, and who had a turbulent childhood, turbulent sort of early adulthood, and nothing was working out for him. And then at one point he says that he finally got a job in Bombay in the Free Press Journal, and he went out there. And when he was given the job, he was shown his desk and said, okay, this is where you'll be sitting. And he said that was a turning point in his life, because he sits down and then he goes to the loo and he throws up, because he realizes that, for the first time in his life, that, everything that he's ever spoken about, he can do it now. Now is the time for him to actually act and get stuff done. And, when you were sort of speaking about that shift to symbiosis, like earlier in your episode with Pooja, you spoke about how you were always blaming others for everything that went wrong, including those unfortunate choices of school or engineering or whatever. And now you couldn't blame yourself anymore. You had to kind of take charge. And another thing that struck me about that episode was how, your wife mentioned that your symbiosis friends remember you very differently from your Bangalore friends.
Yeah.
They remember you as much more driven and focused and all of that. Now, when you came into it, obviously, like you said, you weren't even sure of what PR was. Early on, you shifted into, video production, I think you said. What was that formative period like? Because you are discovering the media now. It's also the early 2000s where the media is kind of changing shape and just becoming a whole different demon. Like I think when I was on your show, we spoke about how I was in MTV and Channel V from 95 to 99, and you made the same journey 10 years later. And yet it struck me later that the organizations that we worked in at that time were completely different from each other. And indeed, they are completely different now from when you left it. So everything is evolving, everything is changing, and you are in this place where I presume some of the teaching must be teaching about an old paradigm, an old world, which is actual. So, a lot of it is just not going to be relevant. You have to figure stuff out. So take me through your process of kind of, discovering what is the kind of work that you want to do, and, and how your image of yourself, therefore, evolves. Like at that point in time, what do you see yourself becoming?
So if I look at my symbiosis time, it wasn't as much about what I was taught, to be honest. I still wasn't focused in studies, right? I would still, like, if you had a 8 a.m. And 3D animation class, I would not show up because I would not be awake at 8 a.m. But there were few modules that really spoke to me, and interesting enough, so I remember my editing teacher, right? He would show us Amar Akbar Anthony, and he would talk to us about certain shots and how they were edited. And he was this fascinating man, and Yogesh Mathur, I think his name was, and he'd come in from FTI, and he would talk about these things, and I was never so I'm not a purist in that sense, right? I won't talk about film the way people do, and digital versus film, and none of those things, right? I'm a product of the 90s MTV. I keep going back to that. For me, being able to have worked with Chinnappa and Cyrus and all these guys was like a dream, because I'd kind of, for me, the benchmark of someone who has really held that spot for me has been Nikhil Chinnappa, right? I mean, by far, like, the range that man has shown, still continues to show. In fact, he's still there, still relevant, is phenomenal. And so when I was there, I think I met a great set of friends, and we all, interestingly, had similar interests deep down. I feel a lot of my friends I still have from Bangalore, great guys. I can hang with them. We'll have a lot of fun. But I think deep down, what we were really interested in, what we could talk about for days and hours, was not necessarily the same thing. And I think that's really the big difference. And secondly, when you're in a communication school, no matter how much structure they might want to put around you, it still is a lot more open-ended, right? You'd have an art class, and you would have a class around editing, and I was terrible at camera, so I will not say camera, and a bunch of those, and I feel that gave me a certain level of freedom, and also because we all were living off campus. Pune was an interesting space at that point of time for us, because we weren't in the huge campus that the Simbi kids are now, and right, we were in this small campus, and we had like 4 rooms, and we'd all live around campus somewhere. So I feel that period for me was great because of the friends I made, and because of the conversations I had with some of my professors. Some of them who were from an old time, right? So when I went to intern and came back, me and Rohit had, my co-founder, we'd used cameras like it was something we could rough around with. But back in college, for a lot of those professors, a camera was, I remember professor said, "Camera तुम्हारी माँ होती है, roti usse milta hai," is the actual thing that was said, right? Because we were playing around with the camera. I said, why can't I just throw it off a thing? I'll pad it up so I can get that drop down shot of something falling. And I saw the shock on my professor's face that I would even think of something like that. But I'm like, it's okay, it's a handy cam, and we'll throw it off. And he really had a bit of a fit, I remember. But more than anything else, I feel you need to be around the right set of people at the right time in life. I feel at every single point, like I would not have been as reasonably fluent in Hindi if it was not for my friends during engineering college who were all Punjabi. I learned Hindi from them, because till then, school Hindi is not Hindi. You do not say hai at the end of every sentence. I have never understood why that is written that way. I learned it from a group of Punjabi boys, almost all of whose weddings I've danced at, and who I meet whenever I can, when they're here or whenever I've been able to travel. And what is fun about the bunch who I met in Simbi's, those are the guys I still hang with even now. They're still my closest friends. They're still the people I can truly be no holds barred, hang the same way we've hung since 2005, 6, I think.
And what was sort of, during this period where you're learning the craft of different things, whether it's editing, and you said not so much camera, but you're learning the craft of different things, what is the kind of art that appeals to you? Like, what are your influences? Who are your idols? Like, of course, you've said that there's an attraction towards MTV and Channel V. Though by this time they had actually changed a lot, because I remember, when I went to Channel V shortly after Quick Gun Murugan happened and all of that, because I was sort of attracted to that. I was there for a couple of years, and I went to MTV, and your ex-boss Cyrus Oshidar joined a bit after that, who you've mentioned in other conversations. And I still remember there was one drastic day where, at that point in time, our early CEO, before Alex came in, was a guy called Sunil Lulla, who I remember when he first interviewed me, he was wearing shorts and green socks, which I thought is so cool. This is what MTV should be. And he would always say that we will only play Western music. We are not going to do Hindi. We are not going to do this. And then there was this regional meeting one day where, there was, I think whoever was charge of MTV Asia came down, and he's like standing in the middle and the entire office is there. And that guy stands there and, reels of the figures that this is how much Bollywood sells. This is how much Hindi sells. I don't understand why we are not playing that music. And Sunil is, of course, nodding vigorously. And we went Hindi with a vengeance. And that was the first shift I saw. And it was still okay. And I came in from this very sort of snobbish and elitist position of, no, I came here because, I love alternative rock. And, I'd be talking about all those great shows in the MTV US. And, I was devastated when they dropped Beavis and Butthead. When I joined MTV, it was playing and they dropped it. And I thought that's a horrible shift. But then what I saw in the 2000s was that the shift was, they just went into reality TV and roadies and all of that, which, not my thing at all. And then they went, it just seems to me that they progressively went further and further away from what I liked them for in the first place. But that's a digression. What I was asking was, what were you looking up to then? Like, you're learning the craft, what kind of work do you want to do? Like, do you want to make movies at some point? Do you want to make music videos at some point? What are the music videos that you really liked from that period?
So, weirdly enough, I wanted to just make music videos. I thought that's what people in music channels did, that we would make music videos. In hindsight, you find out that's not true at all. So, I went through phases. I think for me, some of the typical ones, right? You would listen to Nirvana, very into Kurt Cobain and Jim Morrison. So, when you said, how was I in college? I at some point became that pretentious, okay, and now I'm in a communication school person. It's okay, in college we're all pretentious, so I think that's not necessarily a negative point. So I had grown my hair out a little bit. I would have a jhola on the side. I would listen to Jim Morrison at night after having had a couple of extra drinks, shoot my own shadow in the dark with some light on it, and edit something weird with my own poetry, which was horrendous. And it wasn't like I was not warned. I remember Roy telling me that I was influenced by the world's worst poet, who was Jim Morrison, because I used to read Jim Morrison's poetry books and try to write poetry like him. Not the best frame of reference in hindsight, but that was my frame of reference and that was my influence. So I would write these poems and I would dance in this thing and I would show it in college to some professors who were also a little warped, right? And they would try to find meaning in what I was shooting, and I was just a drunk guy who shooting his shadow. And it was a lot of fun. I used to enjoy. So I remember that I'd submitted a lot of music videos as projects during that time, except for my final project. And so I love shooting that kind of stuff, because anything was arbit, I would try stuff out. But I also realized that I was always a bit of I think a jugaad is the right word. So you would end up shooting a lot of stuff and you realize you don't have enough footage. So you suddenly start reversing the footage to cover up for it and make that seem cool. So I do a lot of those. I should love to edit though. Edit was the edit room was something which I fell in love with very early on, because I felt that's where stuff really gets made. I actually went to MTV at an interesting time as well. My internship, I remember, was in MTV, and I said, okay, I'm going here. I managed to get into the place I've always wanted to get into, and that office was phenomenal. That huge space they had, the vibe of it, it was just more than I ever expected it to be. I remember you walk in the first day and you see Brocha sitting there, and Brocha's doing what Brocha does in life, which is just generally he was in an element of being a prankster in those days. So he was just doing that because you'd pull off bakras on every new person who joined MTV at that point of time. And he was pulling that off on someone, so I happened to notice it. One of my first shoots was with Nikhil. So all that is happening, right? I did research for roadies. But my thing was that, okay, I'm gone here. Let me learn as much as I can. So I worked on every single show that was possible. So that influenced me a lot, because I learned the art of formats at MTV. I actually learned how stuff has to be shot, how you can because we were doing a lot with very little. And we were using time like nobody else was. And I realized that only MTV did that. Channel V never did that, because when I later on went to Channel V, how much ever time it would take me to do 3 edits would take someone, people would do just one in that, because MTV had taught me to work a certain way. They taught me a certain work ethic and almost a structure of working, which just, I feel that whatever we have as internet culture now is still, for me, stuff we did in MTV and Channel V, right? I can take every single format, there is a connection there, and I feel, and I'm a huge format junkie. I love to explore different formats of just not everything, like even how people write a newsletter to how someone makes a YouTube video to an Instagram reel. I look at formats like a hawk. It's one of those things I love to see, because I think it shows variation and gives you something to kind of use as a framework. And I kind of brought that back. So after my first year, when my first year was generally chill, I was learning the ropes and stuff. But I feel I came back to college in my second year after that 3-4 month stint at MTV, having learned so much in that period. And that's when I was clear about what I wanted to do. I knew I could be someone who worked in that kind of television, like youth television. And reality TV was weirdly enough something I really enjoyed. I gravitated towards it because, and I think at that time, reality was a little different than what it became eventually, which is when I kind of tuned out of television. Reality then was saying, can you take a set of people and put them in a situation that will make them react with some sort of emotion, right? So in my head, it's actually, if you go deep into it, it's almost like you're looking at human psychology, right? What will make someone, because you are under pressure, you have cameras on you, and you need to find a way to kind of push someone a little over that edge to be able to react in the way they would naturally would if they were under pressure, but you just have to bring that in faster. So, and we would sit and do those things. And I remember the first time I made someone cry on camera, I felt I was really upset, and I would sit and I remember Raghu came up to me and he sat down with me because he saw I was upset about it. And he kind of sat with me and he spoke to me about the mindset you need to have, and the fact that you're not forcing someone to do this. They've signed up to be on a show. You're doing what you have to do. You're not in any way causing them harm. This is the pressure of it. And so I had a bunch of really good mentors at that point in time. There were a bunch of producers, the entire Roadies bunch. I remember Nikhil was a person I would turn to. I still turn to sometimes, who I'd speak to about how he did all the stuff he did. And I feel for me, those 4 months and the stint I had after that, when I went back to MTV, that was my true university in everything I've done in my career. How to manage teams, how to organize stuff, logistics. I've learned it in that year and a half.
And, a lot of things to kind of unpack there. Firstly, I love reality television as well. But at, one of the early years of Twitter, I think I was live tweeting Big Boss, which I kind of liked much more than Roadies, to be frank, which I thought was, kind of obnoxious and difficult to watch. Yeah. But that's just me. But one of the things that struck me when you were talking about your early forays into Jim Morrison's poetry and all of that is that typically when we are young, and especially when we try to create things, and of course it is a fact that in men, the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for socializing and all that, doesn't really, develop till 25. Which is why a lot of teenage violence and all that is kind of common. So people take time to get formed. And when you're young, often you have energy, but you don't necessarily have either taste or experience. And experience, of course, comes with time, and taste also forms. And I think part of taste forming is, of course, you want to fit in with your peers, so you listen to whatever they're doing. But through all that, there is kind of a core of your own taste, your own aesthetic, your own sensibility kind of forming. So, a couple of things. Like one, clearly from a lot of your work, like your newsletter, especially recently, focuses on things like frameworks and processes and all of that, as you mentioned. And that's a craft of it. And that's also incredibly fascinating. But before we get there, tell me a bit about how your taste evolved during this period. Like out of, what are your guilty pleasures still? Out of what you used to like then, what makes you cringe today? And, what parts of your early work do you look back to and you say, hey, that's great? And what part is, not quite like that?
So I actually look back on a large part of that work and really was sometimes fascinated about the stuff which we did. So I did all my reality TV stuff I actually really enjoyed. Maybe my last show in Channel V, which I can get into, was because the format was so bizarre. And in hindsight, I'm like, I don't even know what we were doing. And it was a show called Channel V Kidnap, where you would have a couple and you would kidnap one of them, and then you would make the person who's left behind and this person's best friend compete in a series of tasks to win money and free the person who's been kidnapped. In hindsight, when I'm saying this out loud, it makes no sense. We made that show. We made a really interesting show, but what I think that was us really just enjoying a format because of the stuff we could do, right? So we would give them tasks, and in each of the episode there were 3 producers, and all of us would have one episode each, and so we were all reliving our fantasies of stuff we wanted to do as tasks. I think we had come to that point in reality TV where producers were just thinking of the tasks and the masala you can get. Like I would come up with stuff where like I've put an entire basement on fire and this person's outside with locked up and the keys are inside and these guys are going with heat suits and getting the chabis out with fireballs going off. And there was a stunt crew and all there. And I would also do stuff like drop one of them in the middle of Ganpati Visarjan and 2 people have to go find them in the middle of it. I got lost. The camera crew got lost trying to shoot them. I was groped. I'm sure many of my crew were groped as well. But we would think of these really bizarre ideas. Thankfully, the entire crew was men. I'm just putting it out there. It was, I think we were doing all of those. But in general, I loved it. The only things I cringe about, whenever I tried to do a format that wasn't Bollywood or reality, I've always been terrible at it, which required editorial or required finesse. So I remember doing a tech show for Channel V when I was there, and it required animation. I'm like, how tough can animation be? The animator is busy. So I just made my own animation. I didn't know how to animate. I just learned, I did something random, put it up on television. I don't know how it went on television. And suddenly the creative director of Channel V looking at TV saying, what is that? And so I was pulled up and I was like, the animator was busy, right? So when I look at some of those, I was like, okay, I sometimes pushed it too far with almost being cocky about it more than being lazy. I think I was just cocky about it. Because I feel that once you're in a certain flow and you're doing shows, when you skip to a different format, you need to skip your mindset. And I didn't skip. I was still functioning the way I would. I actually even moved to Channel V to do Bollywood shows because nobody in Channel V wanted to touch Hindi because Channel V is still doing English, right? And I just love working in Bollywood, right? For me, it was like, okay, 1 second. I've gone to Amitabh Bachchan's house for a shoot. I've gotten to meet him, shake his hand. I've been able to shoot in a set with Ram Gopal Verma, to create a set for Sanjay Leela Bansali. So for me, I would still, you revel in those at that point of time because you have some of those things in your head. And I think it was great fun to do. And I have a lot of fond remembrances of my entire Bollywood shoot period. But I don't cringe at any of that. What I might cringe at would be me trying to do stuff which I should not have tried doing, like animation. But so none of my tastes I ever cringe at because I feel I still go back to many of them. With music is a great example for me. I listen to every single genre possible. Apart from classical, maybe classical something I say I have a Spick Mackey problem, which is that, and when you're younger, if you go for enough Spick Mackey concerts, you have a certain aversion to Indian classical music if you're too young to understand it. So when you grow up, you tend to not want to listen to it. It's not my mother's fault. It's not anyone's fault. It's just that I just did not have taste when I was younger. But yeah, so I don't think cringe at any of those things. I would just say that doing shows like where I put animations up and doing Kidnap were 2 cringe pieces, and Kidnap actually made me also realize I wanted to quit because by then reality TV had reached that point where you didn't have to press those buttons to get them to react. People were reacting on camera because they knew that would get them footage. So for me, that took the fun away of it. The fun of looking at what will psychologically make this person react and really plan stuff out was no longer needed. You could set it up and people were reacting anyway so that they'd be seen a certain way on camera. And I'm like, I'm not here to get like people to act, and never really excited me. So that's also something that's made me tune out.
And in a sense, that sort of extreme move in reality TV where people are reacting because it's expected of them also presages the coming age of social media where everything is performative anyway. But, let's take a quick commercial break, and after we do, we'll come back to 2009 and, the changing times and what you then went on to do next. Long before I was a podcaster, I was a writer. In fact, chances are that many of you first heard of me because of my blog India Uncut, which was active between 2003 and 2009 and became somewhat popular at the time. I love the freedom the form gave me, and I feel I was shaped by it in many ways. I exercise my writing muscle every day and was forced to think about many different things because I wrote about many different things. Well, that phase in my life ended for various reasons, and now it is time to revive it. Only now I'm doing it through a newsletter. I have started the India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com, where I will write regularly about whatever catches my fancy. I'll write about some of the themes I cover in this podcast and about much else. So please do head on over to indiauncut.substack.com and subscribe. It is free. Once you sign up, each new installment that I write will land up in your email inbox. You don't need to go anywhere. So subscribe now for free. The India Uncut newsletter at indiauncut.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome back to The Seen and the Unseen. I'm chatting with Varun Dugirala about his fascinating life and journey. And we've reached 2009, where obviously there is, at a proximate level, one interesting shift where you leave Channel V and you start your own advertising agency, The Glitch. But you've also spoken in the past about how, it's not just a career change. There's sort of a ton of stuff happening around that time. Television is changing, digital is coming up, the internet is changing the way people consume information and all of that. So tell me a little bit about that. What about those changing times is sort of driving whatever is happening?
So this is, I think from around 2006, 2007, there was a bit of an interesting period, right? It was an interesting period mainly because on one end, digital was just becoming a thing. I remember Channel V used to have their website and mtvindia.com. Those were early days of people really putting up curated content online. And I remember there used to be, even for music, I remember Arjun Ravi used to run a website, forgetting the name right now, which used to kind of curate stuff around indie music. And so it would be weird for us who would work in music television, who would go to a website which used to curate indie music to kind of get what was happening there, because we had gone beyond that, right? We were primarily playing Bollywood by then. Our jobs were to do reality TV. There were very few music videos, regular going on. And although I was lucky enough to be one of the last people to do a show called Launchpad for Channel V, which is a show to find next big rock band and stuff like that. And before Rock On and everything else that happened post that. And I remember when we were doing that as well, it was a lot about let's find different languages who would kind of come in. So we got a band in from Cal who sang in English, but Cassini's Division was a legendary band. We had a Hindi band called Faridkot who still play. They compose for a few movies and stuff. So we had all that going, but it was still largely repetitive because I was going from one reality show to the other. I had almost quit twice. I'd almost gone back to MTV because I still had one bucket list item that I never produced roadies. I always wanted to produce roadies because I just had journey and the what that involved at that point in time, something I always wanted to do. So I almost quit. I would say I once walked up to Zulfia, who was my then boss, and I was just going to quit. She doesn't know this. And she said, do you want to do Launchpad? I said, okay, I'll stay in my head. Right. So I stayed and I did that show. But I feel that me and Rohit had come to that point where we had grown up the ranks really quickly in our time in Channel V, because when we were in Channel V and he used to shoot promos and I would shoot shows, there was a set of people who were senior to us who happened to quit around the same time. So suddenly we were assistants who suddenly became producers very quickly. And we learned those things by hook or like we had to learn on the job, right? So a lot of the stuff kind of were put deep into the deep end and figured it out. But when Channel V said we're not going to play music anymore and we're going youth GEC, we're going to fiction, that's when we're like, okay, when we can stay here, we'll have great careers. And Rohit said, I think I want to quit and do something on my own. And I'm like, what are you planning to do? And he said, I don't know, we'll do something, maybe we'll try something with digital video and stuff like that. I didn't know what we were going to do. He didn't know what we were going to do. I said, okay, even I'll quit. And there's a line which I stick by, and I stick by that most times. And I feel it's one of those benchmarks you need to have. Is what's the worst that can happen, right? And so worst case, we'll find a job, and this will fail because we didn't really have responsibilities, right? We had to. We used to say we were paying for bed, bread, and beer. As long as you had money for those three, you'd survive. We spent 6 months thinking of the name. 1 month trying to figure out what work we would do. Quit when we were leaving. Everyone told us it's a mistake because post recession India in the world at 2009 2008 was world was in a people really were trying to hold on to their jobs, and here these two young guys who were doing reasonably well would not have lost their jobs or quitting to start a company where we didn't even know who will give us work. And we had one project, one and a half, and we finished that project and we didn't have work for I think about 2 weeks, 2 3 weeks, and we were like sitting at home because we didn't know how this worked. We just thought we'll talk to a few people and we'll get some work. We never got it. And that's when we really started to understand that we need to be open to doing anything and everything. So we started off as a production house because he used to direct. I was a terrible director, but I could edit and produce. So we would take turns editing. I would produce and he would direct. And we just took projects like that. But we kept trying to do stuff in digital. So we would pitch some stuff, and we both geeks in our own right of the stuff we geek out on. Both was huge into tech, just fiddling around with doing stuff with it. So we would pitch stuff on the side, but we would still do, like, I remember we used to do one of the first projects I'll never forget. We used to do promos for Disney. So for their DVD section. So we would do a promo for Princess and the Frog DVD coming out. So we'd have this DVD come out as an animation, and it would have a voiceover, and so we get a voiceover recorded. So we do projects like that. We made Priyanka Chopra show reel for her to go to Hollywood. One of our first projects, because I remember all the UTV DVDs had come to our house amongst others, and we had to run through all of them, find those shots to show her range of acting, and we were stupid enough to take that money and go buy a TV. Like, we would do stuff like that in the early days. But at some point, I think 6-8 months in, by about 2010-ish, we had Prashant, who's actually still with us, who wrote in and said, can I intern with you guys? I'm hearing you guys are doing some fun stuff. And so he came in from Simbi, realized our office was our apartment, slept on our couch, worked on a project, went back, and he said, will you guys hire me? And that's when we actually became a company, because we realized, okay, we're hiring someone. Then we had a few other people, and a lot of these initial set are people who weirdly connected to us even now. So Prashant's on his third stint with Glitch now. So he's quit a couple of times, come back, wants to be an entrepreneur, wants more to work for Apple for a bit. And there's a second employee was a guy called Venki who came in, who incidentally now works for Netflix. And we end up still doing some stuff together in that sense, right? So in a weird way, there are a lot of these characters who are still around in our lives, but that was also a time when people didn't really get digital. Even I think we were looking at it as a fun, like, it's what podcasting is now, right? People, it's experimental budget for all brands, if at all. And so we would go pitch really random activations and stuff that would, like, if someone tweets this thing, then a random Nerf gun would fire something at a target, and if you hit the target, your handle will come on the screen, right? We would pitch stuff like that, or that we used to do stunts like Diesel was turning 2, and they had to make bring people to their sale website, and the website's creation had taken so long they had 1 week for launch and had not done any publicity. So we made a bunch of 100 people change their relationship status on Facebook from single or whatever it was to in a relationship. And we had Roshan, who unfortunately had to go from married to in a relationship, and he had to answer to a few people on that front, not necessarily Shaheen, because she was fine. And because we made them all post saying, because single is boring and twosome is awesome, Diesel turns 2.com, right? So we would do stupid stuff like that, and like 1,000% increase in traffic on the website because nobody was on the website. So in hindsight, 1,000% isn't much when you look at it that way, but we would pitch that stuff, but also do television. We would shoot stuff for, MTV was still a client. Bindas was a client. We continued to make that pay the bills. And then slowly but surely became a company somewhere in between, and became an agency at a later point, when at some point brands said, you guys are doing all the fun stuff. Do you also want to do strategy? And we were like, how tough can it be? We realized it was much tougher than we thought it was, but that's how we became an agency much later.
So, a lot of what you're saying actually brings back memories, and it's very interesting how, our journeys of a few years apart has these sort of resonances. In the sense, I, straight out of college, I went into advertising, and then Channel V, and then MTV, and you seem to have taken kind of the reverse path. And also in the late 1990s, I I was one of the judges at this event called the Great Indian Rock, which was done by Rock Street Journal and MTV together to find the next great Indian rock hope. And it's around that time also that channel we announced that they were not going to be a music channel but a youth channel, in their words, around 99. And of course, they didn't make the definitive shift until much later, but they carried out a grand experiment in 99 which didn't quite work out. In fact, I shifted back from MTV, I shifted back to Channel V for a second time around that period. Now, my number of thoughts that come up here, and number one is that, did it make a difference that you were, in a sense, coming into this business of advertising, not with an advertising background, as you would expect that people have worked in ad agencies and then they've said we'll strike out on our own, but from a television background. So you're coming at it from a completely different angle, and that makes a difference to how you look at it and what you offer. And the broader question is that, do different angles matter? Because even when you come before that into media, you've got that engineering background, right? You've done engineering and then you're doing mass comm. So in a sense, there is already a little bit of a difference between you and the other guys, and maybe your early love for coding played a part in that. I don't know if coding, helps you think in a more structured way, or whether it just attracts the people who think in a more structured way and the causation is the other way around. So one, do these different frames of reference that you bring into something help you stand out from what's already in the field? And that's number one. And number two is that, do you think that because you weren't from an agency background and you don't have those sort of set conventions and ways of looking at the world, that you brought something to the table, or you saw something that others did not see?
I feel we lack the legacy baggage that comes with advertising, right? And I feel advertising suffers even today with that. I don't have any of that, even though now I've been in it long enough, thankfully, because there is beauty to how advertising used to be done, and there are many elements of that still stay, but it's a very different world. And interestingly, what's been constant in our lives is when we got into the agency side as well, we were a digital agency, right? The digital agency of that time was a lot more focused on websites and banner ads and all that stuff. And we came from production. So our edge was we knew video and we knew how that was produced. So we would go and pitch stuff which nobody would even think was possible, right? I'll give an example. I remember we did something for Cornetto around Valentine's Day, where we said I think we could tweet or write to us on Facebook and give us any lyrics. And we have a set of cupids with musical instruments who would make that into a song and post it for you to share. We actually went and took 11 small tiny studios, those small ones you get in, which you get for auditions. And we dressed up guys as Cupid, people who are musicians, put cameras on them, had an edit team ready. We built a software to be able to edit that out. The software half the time did not work. So we actually had to have manual editors in place. So a guy would write in meow meow, and this guy would make meow meow into a tune, and it would go onto their page. Right? We did that over 3 to 4 days. And what people didn't get was traditionally how even advertising video was shot. Was never shot like this. We were taking our learnings from the hustle that MTV and Channel V had taught us and brought it here, and we would do stuff like this. So by the time we got to being an agency in an agency lens, Brian said, we want that. We want that mindset, but also with you managing what you put on social, because we were very clear we're not a social agency. We'll continue to do we'll do video, we'll do interventions, we'll do all of that for you. And that's how it became one. And then we learned the ropes of, I remember when we first started pitching stuff to do on Facebook, we had people who said, but Facebook's free, why should we pay you to do it? Right. We've actually heard those things. And it was so interesting when I think back on it, because people didn't necessarily know what to do with social. It was one of those, in the checklist, it was the lowest item that you need to have a Facebook page, you need to have a Twitter account, and maybe be on Google Plus used to be a thing. And many of those, and we would just keep pitching stuff. And thankfully, because of video and because we did stuff with clients who people didn't really think about, so we would go to movies, right? So we would do something with UTV Motion Pictures for Burfi, or we would go to Balaji Motion Pictures and do something. So we would go to these guys because they'll want to experiment, because short span want to get buzz in, and we do the bizarrest of ideas. And then suddenly brands like a Unilever, etc., who we were doing smaller productions for, so okay, can you do this also for us? And we still kept the ship sailing by doing TV productions. So we did an MTV Unplugged. We did a season of that. We continued to do those shows till we reached a point where we had a team who understood. So I'm not an agency person. I'm still not. I still look at the production and content business. Thankfully, have been able to stick to that my entire career. Rohit's always been the more creative person who understood the nuances to a broader extent of advertising and design, especially. So he kind of focused on that. And at some point, Pooja came in, and because Pooja had that experience, she helped bring some of that structure that agencies require, which we didn't have before she came in. And she brought that structure in, and that's when I think we truly became an agency. I think we were still a fun buzz creating agency who had a bunch of accounts, but were not necessarily long standing accounts. Still, Pooja came on. Pooja came in and put structure, but she channelized the madness of what we would come up with and do, which would surprise everybody that this is the kind of stuff. And it's not just us, right? The team we had built over time would think of these outlandish things to do. Like, an outlandish sometimes is not the obvious. So I remember when we did the season of MTV Unplugged, the biggest ask was, and I remember Aditya Swami, who was then the head of MTV, had asked us, and guys, we're doing MTV Unplugged here, but most times in India, you have to get a crowd that's not necessarily the audience who wants to listen to the music, right? And we don't want to do that, and because that's traditional practice. Most of the audience you see in all your TV shows are paid audience. The people are paid to sit there and clap. He said, I want actual people. Can you crack that for me? So we figured a digital activation where we had a bus go around Bombay saying KK is going to be doing an MTV Unplugged. We'll pick you up. We'll take you to Trombay, which is the outskirts of Bombay, because that's the studio where we were shooting it. Spend the day there, be in the audience, figure a way to record it, because most times you would end up doing some songs twice just to get a couple of extra shots, get to interact with the talent, come back. And so it became an experience plus a show, which was never the way it was done. So we'd always find these hacks to do it. And I think one of our turning points was a show called Nano Drive with MTV, where we really became digital in our mindset, in a social world. Because what we were doing was we were sending 4 nanos into 4 parts of India with 4 people in them. And every day we would be uploading videos of what happened in that day within that day. Like, so shoot the whole day, edit at night, upload by morning. And basis the number of, and think about it in hindsight, basis the number of views, retweets or likes they got, they would get points which could eventually convert into prize money.
Wow.
So, and the logistical nightmare that was, and this is not like post-Geo India, this is pre-Geo India. So we would have those internet dongles that you would carry around. Every form of internet would fail at most times. Some edit machine would fail in the most bizarrest of places. We did 3 seasons of that. And I think those 3 seasons taught us how social influence worked, how you can really create different kinds of content online that can get this. And because we were doing all of that, it helped us with the brands, because the brands saw that we were doing these things. It's like, how much of that can we tap into? So we had that madness with some form of the strategic thought that kind of came in over time. And then that's just scaled up and became the agency, which is why whenever someone asks me that I'm an advertising person now, I still say I'm not an advertising person. I'm still a content person. I'm still a production person. Because I think that at the root of it, I'm still that.
And a fundamental question about advertising, it seems that what has also happened over maybe the last 20 years is that advertising has changed in many basic ways. For example, just from the point of view of a creator, one of the things that kind of delights me about the modern age is that, if I want to connect with my audience, I can now go directly. I do not need a platform. And typically what would happen is I would sell whatever I am doing to a platform or make it for them. They would then sell advertising and I would get a little chunk of that. And now all of that loop from a creator's point of view is completely bypassed. I don't need the platform, and therefore, and advertising, as Prem Panikkar in the last episode that we did, and he was the editor at a number of online publications like Rediff and Yahoo and all that, and he was pointing out how it's gone from dollars to pennies for comparatively the same whatever. So in a sense, there is a sense of advertising going sort of downhill in that sense. And the particular period of time which you're talking about when digital comes up is like one of the things that you've spoken about earlier is how you needed to change the mindset of your clients and tell them, code, don't do one big TVC. You need 300 pieces of content in a year. So instead of thinking about, one big television commercial which they'll play everywhere and they'll buy space on, maybe Doordarshan in the 80s or all the different satellite channels in the 90s. Now you got to think of this mix of stuff. How difficult was it? And also the other mindset shift is that very often what happens is when a new media comes, it becomes one of the boxes. So you say कि ठीक है Facebook पे करना है, Insta पे करना है, इधर करना है, and you tick those boxes and you're done, and you don't really put your heart into it, and it's just stuff that you do, and it becomes that kind of a game. So what were these mindset shifts, both in terms of getting others to sort of change their mindset in this way, and your own mindset shift? Like, one, of course, it helps that you come from television, but did it also make a difference that you're part of a generation which is used to digital, which is used to consuming on multiple screens as part of sort of your growing up and taking in the world, which might have been very different from some of the sort of managers you're speaking to at these various brands?
A few things happened around that time, right? And I feel it took a certain transition. When we first started doing stuff that agencies do, we were always those people, you who would not even sit on the chairs around the table in those meeting rooms. There you'd be people standing at the back because you'd have someone talk about the campaign, etc. And then, okay, इसके लिए social में क्या करेंगे और इस पे digital पे क्या करेंगे? You almost become that at the end of it. It was never the prime point. We've worked very hard. I think a lot of us in that generation of agencies, there's us, there's Web Chutney, there are a bunch of us. We've worked very hard to have that seat at the table. And we did that by showing a few things. We showed them true value in terms of what they could get out of it. And I feel the learning has been in 3 stages. Consumers learned first because consumer behavior moved very quickly, right? As soon as they could get the internet and start doing stuff with it, consumers adopted this. Like this whole mobile first India piece is so important to think about because we tend to compare things to how the West does it. And the West, even now, for me, is a lot more drilled on from laptop and computer culture. India is very mobile culture. Like that's how our consumers function. That's a very important distinction to make because we're very naturally that way. I go back to my AOL call center days and I think about how they were and the issues they had. And I remember that they were so analog, even at that time. And so because of that, what happened here was that the consumer is shifting and the brands are trying to figure out what to do. The brands adapted first. I have to give them credit for that. Most brands, including larger ones, like I feel like even someone like a Unilever who's fairly large, I have seen that transition from how they were when we started working with them, I think way back in 2011 to now. And even then it was a focus area for them. They were still figuring it out. And now it's a prime focus area for them. So I've seen that with many of them. So they who kind of moved early. Agencies moved last. Agencies for me, not necessarily guys like us who were anyway doing what we were doing and didn't really care about the traditional stuff. The traditional players in many ways, because they also were doing a lot of things which weren't really threatened as much by digital then, so were doing what they were really good at, like you making great television commercials and you doing those long planning sessions and all of those things. And at some point when these two moved fast, and then you had a bunch of these brands coming in who were selling only on digital, right? You have your startups or your D2C brands, and when that happened, stuff moved so quickly. That's when the agency space really got disrupted because brands suddenly switched quickly to saying, okay, fine, let's put, because for a brand, in many cases, become easier because one second, this completes my loop. I can see where my product's being sold. What piece of marketing for me is getting me to get someone to hit buy on a website. And suddenly, so they start moving quickly and everybody started to adapt. And now we're in another weird point of flux in the industry, which is what I find interesting. And it's already happening, but I see the large disruption happening is that, right, before the agencies were the central point of creativity, now I feel the brands are. Agencies are helping facilitate the creativity in many ways. It's very, I know there'll be people who will tell me what I'm seeing right now is sacrilege. But I truly believe that. I feel that brands are taking the ownership of the overall brand and creativity a lot more now than they ever did. It was because it was easier to give to an agency and they would handle it for years. The number of pitches that will happen, the number of people who will come in for each and every project, the number of collaborations that are required. I am seeing more and more the brand teams are filled with people who are thinking of it from a creative lens. And so they're pulling in collaborators. So the agency's role is almost to be, in a way, your navigator, saying, okay, great set of things, don't do this. This is how it will affect you. Or you want to produce 50,000 pieces of creative in a year. This is how I can help you do it at the best ROI. Or this is how you need to work with data. This is how you need to work with your media. So we are navigators now. We're not necessarily people holding the rails in that sense, right? So that's the shift that's happened. Everyone's adapting to it. But when I look at how our journey has been and look at how things have changed, I think the change has really been the day you could turn around from being a marketing team that would say, I'm helping you market your product, to saying, I'm a marketing team that helps sell your product. That's when the whole game changed. Because suddenly you are actually controlling sales, and that just changes the whole game, because you suddenly have that happening, and then your distribution channels of old, which were, you know, what's your channel of sending it to different stores across the country and all of that, and suddenly e-com came in, and suddenly those didn't matter, right? So you can have a tiny startup who just distributing off online, who can hit as much sales as some of the biggest established players of decades of, if not longer. So that's really been the change.
So, I want to drill down on something interesting you said. Like, when I joined advertising in 94, there was this old quote going around, or not this old quote going around then, but I heard it then by John Wanamaker saying, half the money I spent on advertising is wasted, but I don't know which half. And when I did a recent episode with Ambi Parmeswaran, the ad guru, he spoke about how a lot of digital marketing or digital advertising is spray and pray. That you don't really know what's going on. And I chatted with him about metrics as well, which I want to ask you about, because you pointed out that you said that there was a shift where brands began to take attention of you when they realized that you're not just going to help them market their product, you're going to help them sell it. Does this to drill down on this, does it then mean that what you are doing, the kind of advertising that you are doing, is actually quantifiable, that there are metrics that can actually show the impact, so that old dilemma of I don't know, whether this is truly effective or not, it's just a box I have to tick, does that old dilemma then go away? Is it possible to quantify effectiveness?
So it's extremely quantifiable to a larger extent than it has been before, provided, and this is the one big provider, that you set what are you setting benchmarks against, like what do you want to achieve. And that's really important. Many times when that gets missed, no matter what you might get as metrics, whatever might happen, that is where you end up failing. And it's also an iterative game. It's no longer okay, let's make that one perfect piece and have it go there. So it's also iterative. So you're trying stuff out, seeing something that works, doesn't work. I give an old television analogy that, how you would program a television channel for the shows and what would follow what, and what you would make a programming calendar for the year. That's what brands are doing now, right? So you'll have some stuff that will fail, some stuff that will work. But at the end of the year, you're looking back and saying, okay, I did a bunch of these things. These things didn't work. These things worked. These are my learnings, and I'm moving ahead next year. And that's really the way it is happening. I agree with Ambi. I think that there's a lot of so measurement is a tricky thing, because I feel that the word data is thrown around very in a very loose form. Data is not important. What data you look at and how you interpret it is important. So in most cases, what happens is you will try to find data to prove what your idea is to be right, rather than looking at data and deriving your idea from it, which is the right way to do it. So there's this piece that we say in office a lot. I know Rohit says it the most, is that data is a creative director's best friend. Because what you would have, the quintessential creative director who would walk around outside, find inspiration in something and kind of come back. Now it's that same creative director looking at a stream of data and really getting some insights from that. So it's about how you look at it. And I feel, and again, data and content, two words that are the most widely used for bizarrely random reasons across the industry. But data is truly just that. You're getting the insights you would get by doing 10 market visits, talking to 50, 100 consumers. You're getting that by looking at a stream of pieces on a monitor. And as long as you use that right, then that's good data. And I think we're also moving towards a slightly more secure form of doing this, right? We're moving towards first-party data. We're moving towards all of that. And I think while that does affect the business, I feel it's important, because at some point, the consumer should not be the product. And I feel that at some times the tendency is to use data to kind of get to them as the best way you can for the business. But it's important to kind of have that difference in your head. But I think that thankfully it is the way I've seen it. Most brands are very, who we've worked with, have always been very cognizant of that. That there's a line and they don't necessarily want to cross it.
And you called your podcast when you started it "Advertising is Dead," and which is, of course, a provocative title coming from an ad man, though you claim you're not an ad man, but what the hell? Now, what is the scene for advertising? Is it actually dying? Because it strikes me that, when I look at it from the content point of view, a lot of the content I consume, most of the content I consume has no advertising. I've put ad blockers on my browser. I subscribe to Netflix and Amazon Prime, and I'm consuming from there. I literally don't watch any television. The only advertising I consume is possibly during cricket matches when I can just mute the damn thing. And similarly, as a creator, I find that now whatever money I make is coming directly from people. It is not coming through. I mean, I do get some advertising, thankfully, on my show after all this time, but it's a small chunk of what I otherwise make. And the direction in general seems to be, even for creators, to not have to rely on it so much. So now the point is that if content is not reliant on advertising, if that bridge is broken, people are willing to just pay directly for content. What's the future for advertising? What are your sort of thoughts on this? Because I'm looking at it very much from the outside. This is not something I have ever thought deeply about. So enlighten me.
So there are a few things that are happening, which is why sometimes you think about, is the term agency or advertising right for what we do? There are parts to what the agency business is right now. One big chunk is digital transformation. So you're helping clients to really transform every part of their operation to digital, right? So in some ways, you're competing on one end with an Accenture and a Deloitte, etc., because you're helping them build those large tech builds. So everything from looking at how they function internally, how to add digital elements into that, adding tech into that, process flows, everything else. So that's one part, big part of what agencies are doing now. Then there is a big amount of work we're doing even on, like, I think the technology part of the agency business now is so large, it doesn't get talked about enough. You're doing stuff around Salesforce implementation, CRM, you're doing a lot of that. And I see a lot of that growing and scaling and being very stable businesses for agencies. The creative part of the business, I feel, is the one that is actually died in some form when I think of how the classical way of it, right? I think that I'm a huge Scott Galloway fanboy. One of the things he says, which I always liked, is that he says advertising is the tax of the poor. He uses the word poor. I don't like the word poor, but of the people who can't pay for subscription is how I like to term it. And I think that's important. There's still a large amount of people who still are okay to get something for free with an ad in between, and eventually they will pay for not getting those ads in between their content. So that's still relevant. What I feel is important to note is that whatever you make as advertising now has to be relevant for the audience now and not of the old. For instance, whenever someone talks about, okay, did you see the ads during the IPL? I say that you realize when an ad comes on, people are looking at their phone. Because if they're watching it on TV, they're looking at their phone. They're not necessarily paying attention to the ad, right? So then what are you making on as an ad that is playing on that phone, for me, is more relevant than what's playing on TV. And I think those nuances are there, right? So content will still always be the prime focus on the creative side. But when whatever you're creating now has to have far bigger legs as a piece that you would share. When I think of some of the biggest disruptors in the ads, some of the, not disruptors, some of the people who've done the most brilliant work in recent times, like for me, Maximum Effort, which is Ryan Reynolds' brand company, is a phenomenal case study, right? Like, here's a guy who's so creative as an actor and everything else, and he's genuinely funny, who builds this company that does really interesting pieces around some of the brands he owns and the movies he works on, that they are now considered to be some of the most coming up with some of the most innovative ideas around stuff that happens. And he's doing that because he's thinking digital, he's thinking what is shareable, and he's thinking on the fly, versus you don't have 2 months to come up with a script and shoot something. How do you do it? Martin Sorrell famously says faster, better, cheaper is his focus now with Media Monks and S4 and what he's doing. And clients want faster, better, cheaper, but I feel clients also want true value. And I feel that that's what we're doing. So whenever we're creating, we're also not just talking about the creative idea. We're talking about how creating it a certain way will make them spend lesser in the short term and in the long term. I use the word tech stack more than I've ever done in production context over the last year and a half than I ever have. So the actual part which you've always spoken about in advertising, which is okay, let's make the film and let's talk about the thing. So I have not spent any time doing that in recent years. I know a large amount of my team focuses a lot on the strategy part, and that's still very relevant because still thinking long term. But the classical madman-esque advertising for me is dead because that's now a small part of what brands will do in the future, and that's going to go down more and more. What will stay is what all are you creating to connect to every single category of consumer, so and all of that stuff. So I'm not giving a slightly long winding and in most cases random response to your question, but there are so many pieces to the advertising business now that what was traditionally known as the ad business is now a small part of it. It's no longer the whole of it.
That's fascinating. So again, I'll think aloud, and I hope you and other people who really know advertising will forgive me if this next question is a bit naive. But let's do a thought experiment. You just spoke about how Scott Galloway spoke about advertising being a tax on the poor and so on. Let's do a thought experiment. Let's say that at some point in the future, and hopefully sooner or later, either we go extinct or this happens, there's a sort of post-scarcity world where, in a sense, nobody is too poor to pay for content. So everyone's paying for content. Nobody needs to have their attention, sold as a product, so to say, which is what advertising typically is. And so what does the advertiser do? Because on the one hand, as a consumer, I do want to know what is out there and all of that. But at the same time, I don't want any intrusions on my attention. If I'm watching content, I want to watch content. I'm obviously I'm one of the privileged, but I'm subscribing to YouTube Premium. So even there, I don't see ads, Netflix, Prime, all of that. And presumably there will be similar options for any kind of content at all. So thought experiment, utopian or dystopian world for the advertising people, where so then what does a brand do? How do brands reach people? What is advertising? Then is an agency just the people who are doing tech backends and CRM and whatever else you spoke about, or how are they actually managing to get their products in front of the consumer?
A large part of what you said is already happening, and I feel it's already a point in focus. So think of what you consume, which brands are all still a part of, even though they're not ads, right? Think of the entire creator and influencer economy, the influencer economy especially, right? So people do follow so many creators / influencers primarily because of the brand stuff. So, which is why a lot of the startups focus so much on that. And I've noticed this, right? You'll have a startup, they'll do primary focus on performance marketing and e-commerce, do influencer marketing, raise a few rounds, come to that, get that series A round in, then go get that big agency, do that big campaign, right? Because in a country like India, I feel for at least in the near future, traditional mediums are still relevant. TV is not going anywhere. Hoardings aren't going anywhere. A lot of that stuff is still here to stay. Print, I have my own questions on, but that's, I think, more in terms of maybe my habit than I think how like I know people in my house here read the newspaper, right? I don't. So I feel that's more my own personal prejudice, if that's the word to use. And so when I look at it from that sense, the advertising business in the future will exist wherever brands have to connect with the consumer. Today, it's on an Instagram, on an Amazon, on on a YouTube. It might not necessarily just be as an ad. I've spent the last year also studying how creators monetize. And because I thought, okay, as a podcaster, there are certain regular ways that you're known to monetize. What are the other ways? And I realized there's so much happening, which weirdly enough, I didn't know about even though I work in this space, right? So the Amazon affiliate program for me was a revelation. I didn't realize it because I realized a lot of the tech YouTubers I follow all have almost packs you can buy and they make some money off the fact. Because, you follow someone and that guy uses certain equipment. Okay, fine, I love the content, so this must be legit equipment. So you'd end up buying it. And so this person gets something for it. Similarly, how we put some products out there, so I feel that part is going to scale up more and more. Each individual now is a media channel to themselves, and eventually maybe the entire world is going to be an influencer at different categories, and everybody can just kind of keep making money by putting stuff out there, right? I mean, from what I hear, and I don't know enough about it, in China, they've reached a far more advanced stage in this journey than the rest of the world has. On the other end, I feel the traditional ad is going to be one of those big once in a year blockbuster things, right? So it's like how in the US you have the Super Bowl, they have the Super Bowl, we have the IPL. I feel you'll end up having some of these big moment pieces which will have ads happen. I don't think that's going away. They'll evolve in what they are. They might become content pieces, might become series, might become shows. You'll have all those forms, and brands will invest more and more in this. I know brands who are looking at what they do from an editorial mindset now, right? So you look at a brand and say, okay, why would you follow a brand online? Is because not because you want to see their ad, because you want to see what something about the content they post excites you or interests you. And at some point, brands are making that shift to an editorial mindset. So suddenly the content they're putting out is content to itself, not necessarily selling their product. I use this term a lot. I said, consumers either come to you to get two forms of value. One is that you're giving them some value, like a great deal, you're giving them something like that. Or they'll come to you to connect to their values in some way. And that values doesn't have to seem very hardcore. It could be just a form of entertainment or a genre that you like, which really works. I mean, I think of a bunch of brands which are there online, which I follow because I just am entertained by what they post. And I think that's really the future. The future is that brands will go a lot more editorial, and they'll realize at some point that editorial content is also monetizable. It will be a tiny piece of their P&L. But let's say tomorrow, if I'm a beauty brand and I'm doing a lot of these tutorials and everything else and packs and stuff like that, at some point it's helping me sell. But what if some of that content is exclusive? What if some of that stuff is only for a subscription based cohort of consumers, and I'm freewheeling here in my head? Maybe someone would pay for that. You never know, right? I mean, maybe that's the future. Maybe that's the future of what we'll build out as agencies, because as long as brands have to connect with a consumer, there'll be some form of this thing called the agency. Will it be what it was? I don't think so, which is why the name of the show came in. The name of the show actually, interestingly, came from a talk Scott Galloway gave. So advertising is dead comes from this thing he keeps saying called the death of. There was a video he did. I forgot where. I think it was a video from his Stern school class where he said the death of the advertising and industrial. Advertising and marketing industrial something. And so I said it's too long. But if you break it down, advertising is dead is an interesting term to use. And that's how the name of the show kind of came to be. So that's what I truly believe. I think we're already there. It's just that, and it's a good thing, right? You hold on to certain things which are great. There are many beautiful things about how advertising has been, which I've come to learn after becoming part of a network. I never realized that while I was an independent agency. But I don't think we're a generation who is nostalgic about this. At least I'm not. I know the people who are younger. I know there are a bunch of them who are. I'm not. I think things evolve. You move ahead. You can't stay in the past. You enjoy those. You kind of go back and look at those. But yeah, I mean, so that's that form of agency that's going to stay.
So, I'm going to get some of your thoughts on the content ecosystem and the creator ecosystem as well, because that's something I've also been thinking a lot about over the last 1 year. These are exciting times. But before that, to kind of wrap up your, not your thoughts on advertising per se, but that part of the journey. At one point, you got acquired by WPP, and I assume things have worked out extremely well for you. So, there is a journey where around 2009, you leave Channel V, you say, okay, this is interesting work, this is what we're going to do. You get down to it, you go in the directions and you follow those directions. And then you have what I presume is your big payday, and you can now chill and do whatever you want. But you are still in advertising, you're still part of the glitch, you're still sort of doing whatever. And at the same time, you are also exploring these other new directions with first one podcast and then this YouTube podcast, the Varun Duggi Show and all of that. So my question is that, in one of your newsletters, you've written about how you need to think about what you're doing for your career and what you're doing for your life, in the sense that you have to view one as the means to an end. And so how have your thoughts of sort of, the kind of work that you want to do evolved over these last 12 or 13 years since you started the glitch? Where initially you go out there saying, hey, we'll make me videos for digital and we'll do all of that. And then in that journey, presumably as a company grows, your mindset is also changing. You're putting your different kinds of processes in place. Your goals are changing. Then the acquisition happens. Then you discover, the creator ecosystem and how that's going. But at the same time, you have one foot in, you're still running the glitch. So take me through your thinking on all of this.
So when we started Glitch, Rohit and I chose not to have traditional designations. We were called left brain and right brain. I was left and he was right, because we thought that sounded cooler, but also it felt very like, and we just found it very weird that two guys start a company, one becomes CEO, one becomes CCO, and because we decided neither of us will be CEO. So Pooja's been our first CEO, which because the designation didn't exist before she came on. So my role was always very operations oriented, right? Because of my experience with reality TV, I knew how to do logistics. So stuff like administration, terrible math person, but managed finance for the longest time. In hindsight, a very very junior team, and not really focus on that as much as we should have. But my role was always that. My role was to make a few things happen, is to make sure that the ship ran, work with Rohit to make sure the stuff we sold, and that's something which he took onus on, is saying stuff we sold would really come through and executed right. I had to take care of, okay, is there enough money in the bank? Is there, just kind of getting people in, managing their life. So I've always had that role. I've always enjoyed that, having those 50 things to do. Over the years, what also happened is we brought in people, right, who took certain things off our plate. And eventually, once we came towards, and we never thought being acquired was a thing. Like, we didn't even know that existed till someone approached us many years before we even got acquired. And we were like, okay, this is something that happens. We actually even worked with the team, and I remember the team kind of came on because in 2011, Roshan came on to be our first investor. And he was one person who would keep telling us these are things that will come ahead for you. And I feel that he's kind of great person to have had as a mentor partner, because he would never tell us what to do. He would tell us something like this will come up and I will let you guys take a choice and maybe give you a point of view from my experience, but I will not make your choice for you. So we had him to help us out with a lot of those decisions. And at some point, by the time we decided to get acquired, because we realized that's the way to go if we want to scale the way we want to scale, and at the pace at which we wanted to, we then ended up trying to choose networks, and we went through that. And I think post the acquisition, when we finally did get acquired in 2018, I was at a point when I had handed over a lot of my response. So I no longer had to look at finance. Ops was pretty much out of my this thing, because at some point you hand over a bunch. So I was left with a few things to do. And I always like to have different things to do. And this kind of just happened. The podcasting thing happened, kind of filled a gap of stuff I want to do, because I had also gotten very comfortable. I get very nervous when I'm comfortable, right? When you sit and you feel like, okay, I have a relaxed day most days. That's when I get really like, I panic a little bit, because I'm like, when I'm worried that when things are too relaxed, something can go wrong. I'm happy when there is some stress to deal with and there are 50 things going on. So, and that's when this thing happened. And then I feel it's also fed back very beautifully to what I do at Glitch. Right? So I come back to the team, I come back to clients, I come back to people with perspectives and insights, which I wouldn't have gotten if I didn't do the podcast. Not just from the guests. I get a lot from the guests. I feel like every guest I learn something from. But I also feel like I've learned a lot about the talent out there who wants to work in this space, because I interact with a large part of my audience also wants to work in this entire new business world. And I also then get insights into tools that creators use. And so I'll go back to the guys in our production team with hacks, which I am thinking of, which they might not use, right? Because somebody used to using bigger equipment, something which is very like, which is tiny, which is a YouTuber piece. Where like, okay, where did you get this from? And so all of that kind of adds up. But my role over time, while I've played many roles, there are certain clients I've had great relationships with and kind of built that over time. There'll be times when I'll pop. So I've always been that person who filled gaps and gave support. My job is always, I still consider that to be my job. It's just that over time, we've luckily had people who came into the system who said, okay, I'll take care of things till like we have this thing called shit hitting the fan, and there's the level to which people can manage that hitting the fan has increased. So when it still comes to us, it's still going to be a big problem to deal with. But thankfully now we have a solid set of people leading the organization who take care of a lot of that. And so I think that's what I enjoy, which is why I think the creator thing happened, because I suddenly let me get my hands dirty after being in a leadership role for so long. What I don't want to do is to have too much of a team, which is why I really like, it's very shoestring in terms of even the guys you work with on the Varun Dugi show. I'm like, I don't want to hire someone. I'll work with a team who's established. And so I'm very wary of falling into the trap of again becoming this person who's taking care of an organized set of people. Like, I don't want to deal with HR again in parallel and stuff. We have a fabulous HR team now. Thankfully, take that off my plate as well. So yeah, so that's how my roles evolved, and it's I genuinely find that it's great to work with people from this generation, because I feel that they have a very interesting mindset, and I feel that, so I'm late. I'm very like on the border millennial, because 82 kind of just hits that line there. But I feel now the term purpose, while people make fun of the fact that Gen Z has this thing of purpose and whatnot, I feel they truly want to do stuff which kind of connects to what they really believe in. And at some point, we need to be able to do enough to be able to connect to that. And the constant endeavor is to do that. I don't think we succeed all the time as a business world. It's not just advertising, I think in general. But I find that so beautiful about, and I don't know what Gen Alpha is going to be like, but I think Gen Z at least has that. And so that's one thing which really excites me. I think my podcast helps me connect with this group of people who I find so fascinating, who I feel have a lot of the pressures every generation has, but also lives in a world, like you said, right, which is where you constantly, everything you say is on the record, everything, there's so much pressure. There is, your mental health has taken a beating because of everything else. And so in some way, kind of giving back to making sure, telling them the world will be okay.
Right, there are many things to unpack there. But I'll begin by asking a question on leadership. Like, you've in the past quoted Mandela talking about how a good leader should lead from the back, right? So how did you sort of discover and evolve your leadership or your managerial style? Because that seems to be something which you have a very settled version of now, which has come over a period of time. Did that come through trial and error? Were there moments where you had to reorient yourself and so on?
Some pieces were already set in place by the time we started Glitch, because I also led smaller teams, right? So again, I go back to like reality TV. You're dealing with a team of people, right? You have producers, you have camera crew, production team. So I had some nuances of how to handle a widespread set of people. Rohit jokes that I use a lot of my tropes from reality TV contestants on employees in the early years, because I'm like, how do you deal with this person if the person's mindset's this way? So I might have, in all honesty, there is a strong possibility I could have done that. But in general, I've never been a person who gets to, how do I put it? I'm not angry very easily. Right? I get flustered, but I try not to show it too much with a team, because I feel that it only seeps down. And naturally try to be the person to try and find a solve and we move ahead. Have I lost my shit sometimes? Have I said stuff which I shouldn't have said? Have I dealt with the situations wrong? Of course, but I think I've learned from those, and over time, kind of developed a style which was, I think it also comes back to the fact that I don't necessarily want to sit in the room saying I am the center of attention. I never wanted to be that person. I still not. I think even as a creator now, I'm not putting out videos which say, okay, this is what my quote is. So this is what I have said. Right? I'm literally trying to share as much of the people I talk to rather than what I say. And I think there's so much in that, and I feel that I did that as in Glitch as well. Is that I would say, okay, when we've got a great bunch of people together, how do I help them do what they do want to do by with taking off all the headaches which they have? It could be at some point companies become bureaucratic. We have many parts which are bureaucratic. At some point there are stuff which like reading a contract or looking at there are those things which are not exciting for a larger part of the people you hire. So I would take care of those by instinct of saying, okay, let them do what they're doing. I can take care of these. once in a while I'll get a project which I'm really kicked about, and I would do that. And so on and so forth. So I think my style evolved because I naturally gravitate towards logistics. I enjoyed. I'm actually very unstructured, but I still enjoy logistics, and that's why I took to production so well, because production in India is a very unstructured business. It's like the Wild West. So that's how my leadership style evolved, and at some point also because I kept a certain distance, and I learned that from my MTV days and from my Channel V days, that the more distance you keep with, not like being cold, but like there needs to be a line. So I wouldn't like, even when I had like my first assistant producer, I would take care of that person like he was like almost like a kid I would take care of, right? But I would still make that the relationship. I was still not your friend in a normal sense. I'm still that person you can turn to when you need help. I also became this person because of the people I learned from. The producers I had back at MTV, back at Channel V, who I learned good and bad from. I learned how you should not be. Whenever I've seen someone try to make them the center of it, it becomes a problem. Whereas you're always a facilitator. I think being a good producer, and I still say I'm a good producer, is because you're a facilitator. You're not the director, you're not the scriptwriter, you're not the DOP, you're not the actor. You have to make sure the ship runs and reaches its destination. And so I just took that mindset of me being a producer and put it into me being an entrepreneur, and that's always worked out.
Let's move on to, I think, another of sort of the big changes that we've seen in the last decade and a half. You spoke earlier of about how tech has changed so much, and one realization of this was, I think back in 2016, these guys from the US got in touch with me and said, would I do a YouTube series for them, and would I kind of make some videos where I'm talking about concepts for 3 minutes and whatever. And I scripted it, and they said, we'll pay X amount for the production, which was decent enough. Why don't you get someone to produce it? So I reached out to a contemporary of mine who had also done the MTV Channel V thing, and you might even know him, David Polycarp.
Yeah.
And so David is a very dear friend. So David very kindly said, don't worry, I will take care of everything. And he got a 20-person crew to my house, and they moved bookshelves around, and Hazar production went into it. And I was at that time just thinking in my head that, oh, okay, my imagination was that a guy will come with one camera and one lapel mic, and it'll just kind of happen, and there is this massive kind of crew. And recently I've also been thinking of experimenting with YouTube and all of that, building my own setup, researching that. And the thing is that it is incredibly simple. Like even for podcasting, like what I'm doing now, I mean, I'm basically producing my own show, and I can get near studio quality output, with really basic budget equipment. What 20 years ago would have, been a full production involving so much and probably beyond the reach of one person. Today you can sit in your room and, just kind of get it done. And this is something that I think sort of older people, perhaps of my generation, haven't quite fully come to terms with. But younger creators have immediately figured it out because they are native to this. They're consuming this stuff all the time. They're much more comfortable with technology and so on. How has that transition been for you? Because in a sense, you started off in the old world where you are using all those, I presume, those big ass cameras and whatever. But at the same time, like you mentioned, you're fortunate enough to be in a place where the workflows are not that dogmatic, where you're constantly doing jugaad, sugar, and getting doing things very fast, which is very much sort of the YouTube ethic in a sense. Just get it done, just keep doing, throw things at the wall. What was that sort of process for you like? And is that stuff that the agencies also internalized in the work you do? Like you said that you pick up tips from creators and you'll pass it along to them. So, how has that impacted your workflows, for example? Like, what's the workflow of the Varun Duggi show?
The workflow of the Varun Duggi show is pretty simple, actually. So I go through this period of experimentation where I will in sometimes spend unnecessary money on random things and eventually come with a simple solution. So I wanted my, for instance, video to be slightly better than regular Zoom quality. So I bought a webcam eventually, which worked great because it got me. And I'm like, okay, YouTube is 1080. You don't need a 4K camera. Got a webcam for 3,000 rupees that took care of that. So for me, that was great. Took care of one entire piece. Because every time I went to another platform and I've tried many, there was some problem I've always faced in the video part of it. The audio parts have always been great. So I've still stuck to using Zoom in most cases. But my workflow is pretty simple. I have a bunch of people I've kind of working with now. from this company called the Small Business Project. Right? Rachit and his team are fabulous, and I've known Rachit for a bit. And what I've actually done with them is to kind of work with them and say, I tell Rachit, okay, I'm going to give you X, Y, and Z. I need to take care of other pieces for me. And we figured a workflow and also kind of find people who you will meet, right? So some of the guys who work on the audio are like ex IBM who kind of going, so we kind of plug in and they're helping on that front. Find somebody else who's just reached out and said, okay, I'm pulling out insights from episodes. And someone once sent me chapters, right? So, you don't do timestamps on an episode. Someone was nice enough to email me saying, these are the timestamps for your episode. And I said, okay, do you want to do this all the time? I can make it a paid gig. So I think some of those things have organically evolved, and we've putting together a team of people who are naturally proactive and doing stuff, and we're finding a flow. My recording style is pretty straightforward. I actually, one of the first things you said is that I don't do prep, right? Which I always say. My prep is not traditional prep. I do a 15-minute pre-chat with my guests a week before, at least, or whenever I can get a slot. So in that, I scribble a few things on my iPad, and that is my frame of reference. In some cases, their PR teams or whoever will send me some stuff, which I generally don't necessarily follow, but I do find a few pieces there as nuggets, which I find interesting. So I put them down there, and then I let it flow that, because a lot of my audience also, I mean, at least on Advertising is Dead, is a lot more corporate. So I get a lot more info there. On the Varun Dugi show, for me, I call it improv podcasting because I feel it's interesting to kind of bring someone in and have a regular conversation, and let it evolve where it does. And that's what I've been doing. I've been trying to find as widespread a set of guests as I can, and just have a chat about stuff I'd want to really talk to them about. And I'm not really looking at this as being, okay, this is like a show that's focused on X and Y and Z. It's like you learn so much from conversations. So that's how I'm looking at that. But going back to the other part about what I've learned as actual hacks and tools in creation, what's been interesting is it's been an interesting three-way street where I know there are people in our team as well who'll follow some of those YouTube channels. Like, for instance, a large part of what we do is product. So how do you shoot a product was traditionally a very complex, it still is, complex process, because to make it look the way, some of those things, you need that texture, you need, all of that stuff. And that's a very complicated process, and it's very expensive to do. But there's so many of these YouTubers who have these hacks. So I, for instance, follow a few of them, and I keep sending those videos. We have a few of those groups between people in the office, right? One on Instagram, one on WhatsApp, and we'll all keep sending stuff across. And those range from someone's television commercial to someone's behind the scenes video of a YouTube product shoot. And somewhere in between, we found things we will adopt. So we do a lot of product stuff that looks Instagram worthy. Might not be at the same high-endness of what is traditionally a product shot for an ad, but it's great for Instagram. It's great for e-commerce. So also makes it seem like it's content which you normally scroll past. So we build that out, and a lot of the techniques we use to create that is what YouTubers use. And so I love when that happens, right? And when that's happening, and when someone reaches out saying, okay, you use something, right? What do you use as equipment? So I'll tell them this is what it is. So there's times when I've actually sent across stuff which I have bought as random small equipment and said, try and use this. So I remember when we were doing stuff at Fashion Week for Lakme, there was this thing where you need to switch your mindset where you would shoot something on a larger camera, move it to an edit machine, edit it and upload it online when it had to be as live as possible. We started shooting on an iPhone. So every year, the Glitch office would have a brand new set of iPhones come in and the old set sold off. Best investment ever, because through the year, whenever you had to go to smaller events, etc., these phones have fabulous cameras. I shoot, so I'm starting to work on a few vlog like or straight up content like pieces for YouTube. I had a GoPro, I tried to use some other camera. I eventually came down to using my iPhone. I'm like, this is a great camera. Figured a way to, get the right kind of tripod, and I bought a light and all that stuff. But a lot of these techniques, when I look at how people are shooting, like when you mentioned the crew kind of coming in, 20 people, now those shoots, and also thanks to how shoots happened last year, have become that tiny. You literally have 2 people come in. I had to shoot something for a workshop piece I was doing. One guy came with one camera, put the mic in, and had no light because he said, can we just shoot in the day? So I feel finally coming to that point of getting as many people as required. In India, we have too many people on a set. it's a problem. We great in giving employment. It's fabulous, right? You will have one guy walking around giving people Bisleri ka bottles to drink water on a set, right? Traditionally, you go abroad, someone goes and takes their own water. They'll have a guy to pick up two boxes. You'll have one more guy. So for everything, there is somebody's job, which is great in a larger context, but also makes it a very crowded space and makes it very noisy. Whereas, like, and I think we finally come to that point. I mean, obviously, we have to figure how all those people are going to survive, what they're going to do, and they've all, and some of those things have gone back to normal, right? Shoots in many of those cases still happen the same, but we finally realizing, especially from YouTubers, that this stuff can be shot this way. You don't necessarily need 50 people for everything. You can do it with 5 people. It's just that we never tried to do it because we thought it's simpler and more relaxed to have one person to do every single thing. And that nuance is fabulous now. And most time creators like, I don't know, want all this. Just give me a phone and I'll go shoot that. The way they shoot is interesting. I've learned so much from that. They believe in archiving, which is fabulous. Because they'll see something random, they'll shoot it, they'll store it in their phone, and they'll use it at a later date. It's just there in their stock of videos, which we would never think of as stock footage.
Yeah, I mean, you get into the habit of you shoot B-roll all the time and you never know when you kind of might use it. So tell me about, your beginning to explore the creator ecosystem. Like, first of all, when do you start thinking of yourself as a creator in this sense? Is it when you start doing advertising is dead, or is it some way kind of into that? On your newsletter as well, you've shared plenty of insights about sort of the creator ecosystem. You've spoken about how do you build frameworks. You've spoken about what you call the intimate content ecosystem. Take me through, your personal narrative of how you begin to think of yourself as a creator, and then about how you begin to set up those processes by which you kind of create, and how that conception of yourself is evolving to begin with before we actually get down to what the ecosystem is like.
So I think I truly became a creator in my head. While I've always dabbled in these things since I started the podcast, I think by the time I hit like 75, 80 episodes of Advertising is Dead, I'm like, one second, this is actually a thing, right? Because I think for the first 50, I was still figuring out what I was. Like, it took me a while to even think about the fact that I was a podcast host, because I used to always mumble as a kid and through college. So I was never clear. Like, I would be in meetings and I'd be told, talk slower, people aren't getting what you're saying. And to go from that to me doing this as like almost something which I do almost as half my job. And I'd say that in the nicest way possible. And it has been an interesting transition for my own headspace. And I feel that I've become a lot more confident about the things I'll be able to do. I've always had confidence. It's grown over the years since my days in Bangalore and everything else. But I've truly been able to, okay, I can actually do this, happened around 75 episodes. Around 50, I was happy. Around 75, I'm like, what next? So I remember that when I finished 50 episodes, I made this note down saying notes post 50. And one of the things, okay, what are the things I need to now work on? Because till then it was about, let's get the show in. That's when I really started looking at my programming a lot more, about how do I make the variance of my guests interesting? How do I look at what's happening around the show in that sense? One day someone told me that, why is your Instagram account so boring? I'm like, what do you mean? I said, if you go to it, all you see are teal and yellow posts. Because I wasn't posting anything except for the episode creative every week. They said, people want more from you around the show. I'm like, that seems like a lot of work. And so I tried, and I started sharing random stuff. There was no plan. Something I'd find interesting, I would share. I was still not a creator. I think I became a creator fully in full-fledgedness when lockdown happened, because I was suddenly at home. I had bought a mic because I wanted to dabble in recording some stuff myself. And also because I'd said sometimes you might need some patchwork. I didn't want to travel all the way back to the IBM studio to do it. Let me just buy a mic. So I'd bought a USB mic and it was there. And when I started to create this, I started enjoying all the smaller pieces, right? Because sometimes when you're in a studio, you miss all the other stuff you could do around it. And I think the first couple of months of lockdown as well, because there wasn't much you could do. Work also wasn't as hectic for a lot of us because there was not as much happening on many fronts. So that's when useless information happened, because I want to not just talk about advertising and marketing right now. The world's in this space. I want to talk about something that is utterly random, which is why useless happened. I was like, this is going to be you need to have that 1 hour of irreverence of any random conversation. And this is what that show is. And the more I read it, then I started looking at how other people post. I started looking at how to create. And slowly but surely, I started enjoying many elements of it. I also realized it doesn't have to be that complicated. I feel that that baggage you take from having short stuff and create stuff with all that stuff around makes you not want to do it. Whereas I feel that that's what the difference between generations is that people now were born with a phone which they could create with. Whereas when cell phones came into our lives a little later in life, right? And then the cameras and everything else. So I discovered that in 2020. I think 2019 I was still dabbling and I wasn't committing to it. I've had friends who in the space said, okay, why don't you do more with this? And that you need to decide if this is a hobby or if this is something you're doing seriously. Even me being a podcast host, right? So I said sometimes you're giving so much time and effort and money as being just like the time I spend on it. Is it going somewhere or are you just doing it for fun? So decide that and plan it that way. And I have a few of these friends who will always put these points in my ear. And whenever I'm just, because I tend to get into a flow, enjoy the flow, and not really think about how this could be in the future. And I have a few of them, including Pooja, who will sit me down and say, think about why you're doing this and think about, and put that down and then move with that. And that's what I've been doing. But yeah, I'm just enjoying sharing more and more. I found new formats. Instagram was something I started to do a lot more in 2020. And then I started looking at the kind of content I want to share. So I started sharing stuff about books because I've been terrible at remembering pieces of books. I find it fascinating that you remember so many of these things, but I don't remember anything. So I found an app called Readwise. And Readwise has been fabulous for me because everything I would bookmark on my Kindle would show up there. And I'm like, and I'd keep going back to it. It would give me like a few things every day or something I've bookmarked or something which I've marked up. And so I started just sharing that. And that started to be something people really enjoyed. My workout videos were a random thing I just started to do because it's a large part of how I've been able to push. I need to find that one piece to anchor my day, which gives me like, it's my form of meditation, right? That 45 minutes to 1 hour I work out every day, and I work out every single day. I took a week off, started again when we're recording this. And it's been one of those things. So I just started to share a bunch of these things, gone back to my love for formats. So trying a live format, try Twitter Spaces out, try a newsletter. All of these things have come from thinking, well, let's just try this out. Maybe I'll enjoy doing it. And also from time to time, pull back as well. Pull back and say, okay, you're doing too much now. Think about all the stuff you want to do and don't want to do. And recalibrate as well and kind of come back. So that's been my creative journey. It's been about what do I want to share with the world, which I feel they'll get some value from, which I'll also enjoy doing while I'm sharing it. And I realized I have a lot of those, and I still have many more which I still want to work on and share. And so that's what's keeping me going as in this whole creator mindset of mine.
So I'm kind of going to ramble a bit and also give my gentle disagreement with something you said in one of your posts. But first, a ramble, which is that, when I was teaching a podcasting course and people would ask, what should I make a podcast about, or where are the gaps in the market and blah, blah, blah. And I would always say that, listen, everything's been done. Every idea is out there. Every format is out there. There's nothing new. Even if you find a gap in the market, 50 other people will. The only thing that makes your show unique is you. So you have to be authentic to yourself. And in a sense, that's also how I defined The Seen and the Unseen, is that this is a show that is documenting my intellectual curiosity. I have conversations with people I want to have conversations with. And like you correctly said, you have something to learn from everybody. Every single person on this planet knows something that you don't. So if you have the opportunity to have a conversation and learn some of that, that's incredible. Now, as you were speaking, it struck me that, everything else that you're doing, whether it is sharing the things that you found interesting in the books you read, or whether it is your workout videos and so on, also feeds into that same thing. It feeds into authenticity and who you are, which is what will ultimately draw someone. Tomorrow if I announce that, hey, The Seen and the Unseen, I'm taking a break, someone else will do the interviews. It's not the same show anymore. It's completely different, right? And ditto with Advertising is Dead, or in fact, any good show done by anybody. In fact, one of my editors who have shared with IVM till now was one day telling me how it's fascinating to him that the same guest will come on my show and your show and say Karthik's show, and it'll be a completely different conversation which is one of the delights of it. And the gentle disagreement is because I think at some point you were speaking about what you should keep in mind when you're starting a podcast. And I think the second of your questions, if I remember correctly, was why you? What do you have that is special, that is whatever? And I think in a sense, that is the wrong question, in the sense that one, everyone is sort of, unique in the way. And secondly, even if you're not an expert in something, the point is that you are on a journey which many other people are on at different stages, perhaps. So there is value in your sharing that part of it anymore. So someone who is, for example, watching one of your workout videos might aspire to work out like that, might be a person who works out himself and is looking at, hey, how someone else does it, a fellow traveler does it, so to say. I would imagine that people who listen to our respective podcasts have thought about many of these things, are interested in some of these things. It doesn't matter if we per se as hosts are not special. It is our, sort of journey that we share. And to that extent, it seems that a lot of what makes creators stand out is that element of being true to themselves. Like when blogs came about, people used to disparagingly say of blogs that, hey, who wants to know what you had for breakfast? And I'm like, no, actually, in a sense, many people want to know what you had for breakfast. What are your sort of thoughts on this?
So I want to clarify that the point you disagreed on, right, is that, so why I said that why you is because if you are not convinced as to why you the person to do this, you will not stick on to this for too long, right? Because I feel a lot of people start a podcast saying, oh, I want to do it because somebody else is doing it or somebody else is doing this. That authentic part you spoke about is exactly the reasoning. And I agree because it's a journey, right? Like I do this 25 episode thing. Every 25 episodes, sit down and say, why am I doing this? So I revisit that saying, why am I that? Which is why at some point I said, okay, I can't only talk advertising and marketing. Let me talk about business as well for advertising is dead. The Varun Dugi show happened because I'm interested in personal development. I'm interested in workflows and everything else and productivity as such. And so all of that is how that happened. But what I feel is interesting about the guests and the voice is that I agree with you. Podcast for me, the biggest revelation has been is that it's such a simple medium in that it's voice and it's conversation. It is the kind which we do. But it's also so liberating because you're not constrained by studio set lights, which is what a lot of us get constrained by in video, which I know that YouTubers and reel makers will disagree with me because they don't necessarily have any constraints as well. But I feel it's a medium where you can actually go deeper into things and really get insights which you personally want to get out, and people will find insights from that. And what's also kind of interesting is that I've had my own journey in the way I speak on the podcast over the last 2.5 years because I feel that I've evolved, right? I've evolved my learning. I've evolved with the kind of guests I want to bring on, kind of conversations I want to have, because also at some point, I agree with you that people come in for the host a lot more than the guests because they want the host's way of having a conversation, the way of digging into what the matter of that episode is, subject matter of the episode is what interests them because they relate to that, right? It's like, so I speak to some people about some of the most popular podcasts globally, right? There are many people who don't like Masters of Scale. I kind of agree with them in some context because I find Reid Hoffman to be great in some conversations, not so great in many. I feel he uses sound design to cover up for many of his own issues, maybe in the way he does it. Similarly, I remember listening to this podcast called Inside Voices, which has been my find of last year. And Inside Voices was a podcast where the conversations are only with podcast hosts. I forget the name of the host of the podcast, but he says that, what does your voice sound like? And I found that to be such an interesting question because it has two, and he takes it in both the angles, right? What do you think it sounds like? Yet, what does it really stand for in terms of what it sounds like? And he takes both those contexts. And I found it, and that podcast for me made me think so much about who I am and what my own voice was. And that's actually when I built this framework out of thinking about how to make a podcast. And I realized that frameworks were a thing as the deeper I went into the productivity YouTube rabbit hole. But I mean, that podcast taught me a lot. I remember went back to some, there's a podcast host called Matt Gawley. Matt Gawley does 8 podcasts in last count, which I've seen. And I was like, how does someone do 8 podcasts, right? I think even he's also on Conan's podcast, if I remember right. I'm not sure entirely. And so his thing was interesting, right? Because his thing was the curiosity of the different realms he has of interest and how he works on it was intriguing to me. So there is so much there to unpack that at some point you're kind of sitting and you're learning and you're reveling in it and you're letting it flow. You're hoping people are along for the ride and you're hoping that they learn something from it. And you'll also very easily know if people don't like it. I mean, I've once in a while when I've tried something slightly different, someone will write in and say, okay, I didn't like this. And you learn from that, not necessarily follow it, but you'll also learn from it.
Fascinating. And tell me about frameworks now. Like, in your newsletter, in the November 7th edition, to be precise, you spoke about 3 ways to build a framework, which I found very relatable because that's almost exactly what I try to do, not necessarily what I do always. And I feel that, building a framework around something that you're doing helps in 2 ways. One, it helps clarify exactly what you're doing and sometimes why. And two, then it makes the process much easier. Then it's not a mishmash of stuff that you have to somehow get through. There's just an easy way. You're sitting down and you're kind of getting the job done. It takes those sort of mechanical elements out of the way. Tell me a bit about how your thinking of frameworks evolved and how you developed your own workflows, and what are these 3 ways?
So I actually got into frameworks very recently. I never knew the term framework was the right term to use for a lot of the stuff. So sometimes when someone would ask me to plan something, I think formats were my version of frameworks. I know that that's a term I've used a lot through this episode. Um, and at some point when I would do any form of work, I try to come up with my own system to do it, my own reasoning as to why it has to be a certain way. And there are few YouTubers who I've actually learned a bunch of stuff from. Casey Neistat has been one of my long time like favorites for just like the process of what he did. But I knew that I love his episodes where he draws stuff out with the marker on paper to show how stuff happens. I discovered Matt Diavella at some point, and Matt Diavella is deep into productivity and everything else, and very like again I learned something. There is one YouTuber who his name is Nathaniel Drew, and I discovered him sometime I think late 2019, and I found his story fascinating. He's a young guy from I forget where in America who learns languages, who travels the world, and the way he even shoots, the way he narrates is so classical. But he goes back into um, he builds out frameworks for his own life and just like talks about that. So at some point, as I start putting those down, and I came across the term framework, I saw okay, one second, there are things you do in life, and I feel that the reason why the only way you can do more in your day and yet be healthy, get enough rest, etc., is if you build routine into your life. I think routine is the framework for life, right? So for me, my process in the morning in many ways is templatized. Like it's a standard flow. I will do X, Y, and Z right after each other, and that's my framework for my morning. Very rarely gets altered unless I'm traveling or something else is up. And I feel that as you build those things out, you then can bring them into every single thing. Every single thing you do can be brought down to a framework because every framework is also adaptable. It's not rigid. In my mind, it is fluid, and that's how I came across it. And then I started reading more and more about frameworks and trying to see what people have used, and I get more ideas from that, right? So sometimes I try to adapt a framework, sometimes I try to use literally, sometimes I try to come up with one. In many cases, what I've come up with, so my newsletter sometimes I experiment. Some of the frameworks I've put across, which I've come up with, are experiments or frameworks I came up with while I was writing that newsletter. It's not like I've thought about before. When I'm thinking about a certain topic, I'm like, what could the structure for this be? What could the format for this be? And I came up with it and I put it down. I have also had some very badly written frameworks, which when I read it after I write it, I'm like, okay, this doesn't work. So I'll scrap it and I'll write something else. But that's I think I love that. But it's that I think that love for formats has now come into this, and it's just made me think about like the other day I was talking to a friend of mine. His name is Munjal Kapadia, right? He also does a podcast. He's also our doc. We had Leah with him, and I was like, "Is there a framework for being a dad?" And because he and I talk a lot about being fathers, because I think we are modern fathers of this generation are so different from how dads were. Like my dad was a certain way. He and I have a fabulous relationship, but I think that a lot of what is part of my role as a father involves being a lot more hands-on than it ever was for anybody before me. And I enjoy so much of that, right? And so as a, is there a framework for that? And because I feel that everything in life can be drilled down to a framework, but that framework might not necessarily work for everyone. It could work for some, not work for the others. And the more I put it down, at least in my head, for a person who's so unstructured, it helps me bring some sort of structure into my own mind. And I feel that's why frameworks are important, especially if you're unstructured, to kind of keep putting down.
So, is there a framework for being a dad? What's your framework?
My framework for being a dad is a few things. I haven't put it on paper, but I feel that to be a dad, you need to be the balance of a person who has enough time and a set of interests. So if I look at the quadrant, right, with me and Leia, there are things which only she and I do together. So it's that one part that's only her and my thing to do. And there'll be small things. For the longest time, it was me just taking her to the loo when she had to do number two, right? It was our thing that dad takes me, Papa takes me to do that. Like mom doesn't take, Annie doesn't take, unless I was in a meeting or whatever. Or it could be the fact that there's this book I read for her very often of recent times. I'm trying to get her into Star Wars because she is named Leia and it's Vader's little princess. But how I read it is that I don't read it literally. We look at what's happening in each page and I come up with stories. I want to teach her how to imagine, right? Having an imagination has helped me through life in boring classrooms, in boring meetings, at times when I was just generally bored or didn't have anything to do, or just kind of imagine what life could be like. Find your happy place and things like that. So some of those things are stuff which she and I do together. I'm also the person who in her life will be the most, I think strict is a bad word, but she knows that when I call something as a line, I give her a reason, and she knows that I will not flinch from that if with that reason, right? So everybody's surprised that I would be the strictest person with her because I'm not that person at all in with anybody else. But I feel that you need to have one. There's a line between being a parent and being a friend. I don't necessarily need to be her friend, but I need to be her parent, and I feel that that's a distinction. So while there's stuff we do together, there is stuff which are things that she knows I will have a say on. And then beyond that is the fact that I'll always have time for her for stuff that's important for her. So she has a twice a week skating class. So I'm making this up while I'm talking to you. But if I had to put on this, I feel that as dads, you miss a lot of things in the past. When I look at for many people's fathers, my dad's had to miss stuff because he's a doctor. I have a case, you can't come if it's sports day and stuff. I understand all of those things. But for me, it's very important that there's some things that are part of Leia's life, which I know will be important to her, which if I'm not a part of, that's me not doing what I have to do as a father. So stuff that we do together, stuff that's important to her, and then stuff that's important to me, rather, which is the stuff I'm strict on. Saying, okay, you need to, like, I want her to learn to take her own shoes and put them in the shoe rack, not leave them around. It's a small thing, but I think it teaches you to keep things in their own place and keep them organized, or rather keep them, how do I put it? I have a thing about not letting things get spoiled because you don't take care of them. Like I still have a lot of my toys from when I was a kid because I took care of them. They're now with her and I'm trying to make sure she doesn't spoil them. So some of those G.I. Joes have landed up with her now. And so I'd say that it's the triangle of those three things is what being a dad is. And you're just around for the ride. I feel that fathers and daughters and fathers and their kids have a very interesting relationship, but it doesn't have to be a disjointed relationship. And I don't have a disjointed one with my father, and I don't want her to have one with hers.
How much does conscious thinking about frameworks affect whatever the framework is a framework of? For example, in that episode of Advertising is Dead with Pooja, she speaks about how you guys have a relationship which is almost not like a conventional couple. You look at it more as a partnership and, obviously you're very good friends and all of that. And I think you also spoke in that, or one of you spoke in that, about how in the early parts of the marriage, it was kind of more standard and then it evolved to becoming this. So do you think that and we all our relationships are kind of, in a sense, driven by inertia, that it falls into a particular groove and then it stays in that groove unless it is forced out of that groove by an external event. So, do you think there is something to be gained from all of us in just sitting back and reconsidering the things that we take for granted and the grooves that are running, and thinking of what is the framework here and is that the right framework? What should be the framework here? Because a change in framework, it seems to me, can be profound. It can affect, not just both people but everyone around them. Like a very charming picture of your daughter that I saw on Pooja's Instagram page was where she's cooking something and she's sitting on the platform itself and she's making some bread and cheese or whatever, and a lovely photograph, of course. But it also strikes me that almost sort of a symbolic image of what you'd expect a young girl to be when both her parents are strong independent professionals and relate to each other with a certain kind of respect, and not which many frameworks of traditional Indian marriages actually don't have, even within privileged households. So do you think there is something to be said about figuring out the framework for everything that one does?
I feel it's all about balance, right? It's about, so what Pooja and I found over the years that we've been married is that there are certain things that are important to me, certain things are important to her, and there's some things which bother each of us about each other. And it's in the same way it goes with Leah, it goes with anything else. And there are some things you can work on, some things you can't. It could be as simple as, I'm a person who, when he's sitting, keeps shaking his leg. I have that nervous tick of that person who shakes his leg. It irritates the hell out of Pooja. I have still not been able to sort that out in all the years we married. It's been over like what, 8 odd years that we've been married. But I know for a fact that she knows that I like my things a certain way. Right? So for me, my morning time when I brew my coffee and I go do my business are very important. My mood for the day gravitates around me doing my business in the morning, and I feel that's I'm putting it as nicely and less graphic as possible. Whereas Pooja likes the house arranged in a way that it's lovely to look at. And so before I go to bed, I make sure stuff is put in its place. It's my thing to do. I would not have done that before we were married. I would just leave things as they are. But I know it's important to her, and I don't mind doing it. I'm a person who enjoys washing dishes. I find it lets me zone out of the world, and it's weirdly therapeutic in some cases. So early lockdown was not a problem. So the way I look at it, but I think you find those pieces, and the more you find those pieces, you also then figure out what those grooves are that you spoke of, right? Sometimes you find something neither of you will want to budge from, and then you need to have that conversation to find that new groove that kind of comes in. And that's what early periods of any relationship are, that you're trying to find those, what are the non-negotiables, what are the negotiables. And the non-negotiables, I feel in most cases you either come to terms with, but if you don't, that's just going to be stuff that sticks for a long time and create issues. We've luckily found very few non-negotiables where one of us is going to come to terms with it. And I think that's how you evolve it. So it is in a way a framework, but I feel it's something that also evolves with how we evolve as people. Like when I met Pooja and she met me, I feel we were also very different people than we are now, 8 years later. We were both grown. So it's still an evolving piece. What could be I was not as ambitious a person as I am now when she met me, even though I was an entrepreneur and I had glitch going on and everything else. I'm a lot more ambitious now because I suddenly see there's so much more I could do with what I've been able to build and do in life. And similarly, for when I look at her, always seen Pooja as a certain way with her career, but I'm seeing the stuff she's doing just like beyond the workplace and the stuff she's focused on from a purpose standpoint, etc., which were always there, but I feel that she's found that voice. So I feel that we evolve as people. So you evolve those grooves and those frameworks as well, but it's conversation. It's important in any relationship to not let, and I believe that the biggest problems in the world can be solved by a conversation. And I feel that we don't have conversations where you're trying to listen to the other person. I think conversations are people think it's a lot more about speaking. I think as a podcast host, you realize it's a lot more about listening than it is about speaking. And I feel that we don't listen enough. But in any relationship, as long as you listen enough, you find some nuance to what the other person's point of view is, and you work around it. And as long as you do that, you'll figure a way to evolve it and to make it work.
No, like you correctly said, one of the things you learn as a podcaster, if you're paying attention, is how much you need to listen. Like, Stephen Covey once said that we don't listen to understand, we listen to respond, which is a really bad habit that you actually. And I think, and this is something I discussed with the great podcaster Russ Roberts when he was on my show, is about how there is actually a moral component to having a good conversation and to actually listening. Like, Immanuel Kant famously spoke of the categorical imperative that you don't want to treat, another human being as a means to an end, but as an end in themselves. And very often when we are in conversation, we are doing exactly that. We are treating other people as a means to an end. Either we want to show off how smart we are, so you'll find, hosts interrupting all the time, and, just to do one-upmanship or looking for gotcha moments and all of that, which is horrible. And I think that once as a podcaster, you start realizing that you need to get the ego out of the way, get the self out of the way, and just sit back and listen, then, it would strike me that at some level, that's then going to percolate through to the rest of your behavior with people, where inevitably you will also be in some situations treating some people as a means to an end. So, could becoming a better podcaster make you a better human being?
Oh, 100%. I'm a better human being as a podcaster now than I was before. I was a terrible listener. I was openly called out for being a terrible listener because I have a tendency, which my daughter has gotten from me, I believe, which is that I can zone out very easily. So I could be talking to you right now and my eyes will glaze a little bit and be looking into the horizon and I'm imagining something which is more interesting to me than what is going on right now. People have let it go. People have called it out through my life. But being a podcast host, you don't have a choice. You have to listen. Have I been guilty of sometimes zoning out? Of course. You will sometimes have those instances in every so often in an episode where you're like, yeah, it's okay. It's on autopilot. I can glaze off for a few minutes. It's happened. But it's made me a better human being because I feel like when you're really trying to drive a conversation, you're really trying to understand the other person, right? You're trying to understand what makes them tick, which is why I think I do a podcast, is because I talk to, like, advertising is a lot to the people are corporate people. But I found such interesting people with such interesting interests and thought processes and lives that many times that part excites me so much more than the actual business part of it. The business part of it is great. It's great to get into and you understand all of that. But the nuances of being human is so interesting because I feel people's driving forces, people, what interests them has always been something which I always looked at, which I found interesting, and it gives me a way to kind of dig deeper into that.
Yeah, and actually, the most rewarding parts of some of my recent conversations are the sort of, where you're not talking about the subject per se, but just about the person and their journey, which, like, many people were very, very moved by, my episode with Ghazala Wahab, especially the first 90 minutes where we spoke about a personal journey. Or I had the grizzled financial journalist Tamal Bandyopadhyay on my show, and he started off the show by chatting about how during the lockdown, it was so heartbreaking for him to go out on the streets of Bandra and see people who had earlier been vendors now begging, and one of them, held his hand and took him to a biryani stall and said, please buy me something. And, those glimpses of a person's humanity are, I think, kind of what make many of these conversations so rewarding. To get back to frameworks for just a moment and for the very last time, if you are to sort of give advice to creators, like if there is someone out there who's thinking that, hey, I want to do a podcast or I want to do a YouTube show or I want to create whatever, and can you give me an easy framework which I don't necessarily have to follow all the way around. I can discover my own thing, but can you give me an easy framework which will help me get started and think about this? And I think in your newsletter, in fact, you had actually done this. So what would you say? How should one begin to then approach that problem where you've got a ton of ideas and creativity and all of that, but you want to actually, do something with it and bring it together?
I feel that in today's time, to be a creator, you need to be able to play the long game, saying how long can you do this? And which is why choosing what you do as a creator is so important. It could be that you write, it could be that you do a podcast, could be that you just make fun videos on Instagram, could be that you tweet. I feel that I've off late I've rediscovered Twitter in many ways because I feel that somewhere the algorithm for me has changed and I've gotten this set of people who were giving me a lot of insights in many things, right? So you need to find what your medium which you can do very easily is. And I say easily because it should be natural to you, right? If there's a learning curve, then you have to take your time to do it. And I remember when I had Tanmay on my podcast, he had said two things, and I found both of them very insightful. One is he said that there are two kinds of YouTubers. One are people who are supreme experts who will do 1 to 2 videos a month, right? You're really working on it, pulling it together and stuff. And those guys, they work on every single nuance. The other kinds are people who are doing stuff every day. There's almost every day something coming out. It's just that you're hitting you with so much volume that you will find something that you enjoy. And at some point, you're almost like waiting to see what you will do tomorrow. And the other thing he said was, he said, what would you do for no money? Who should be what you should be as a creator? Because at some point, you are a creator not because you want to make money or want to be a star, but you're a creator because you really enjoy doing it. In like, I follow this guy called Ali Abidal on YouTube. Right?
Ali Abdal.
Ali
Yeah.
Abdal. I discovered him very recently, in I think like late last year. I find his journey so fascinating, right? For a guy who was putting up YouTube videos on how to prepare for medical exams, which I thought was interesting because he was doing it anywhere. So very easily could make it, but he was interested in this. To now being this person who's not, he's taken a break from medicine and doing all the productivity stuff he's doing because of all the content he's made. Such a journey, but I think at every stage he was doing something that he would naturally be able to do, would love to do, and it just brings so like that flow of authentic content coming out is so important because this you can't manufacture this for too long. And whenever you try to manufacture it because somebody is, because you will find, like for instance, you'll find many Gary Vee clones out there, right? People will watch Gary Vee content. You will find 5 people who are doing exactly what Gary Vee does. I've actually dug into Gary Vee's frameworks, which he shares openly about how to create content. I think they're fabulous frameworks. Like there's so much to learn from how he says how one piece of content can give you 10,000 pieces or whatever, 6,000 pieces of content. And I think that's a great insight. Do I agree with most of the stuff he says? No. I find him entertaining in some, find him insightful in some, find him repetitive in most. But doesn't mean I have to become him. I can learn something from him to make what I would come to me naturally do, because I will never speak like that. Even if I ever speak about business or speak about entrepreneurship. But I look at, again, certain nuances of it. So I feel what's most important is to find what you can naturally do all day, every day. Do it quickly. So my newsletter, for instance, something I write like in one flow, get done with it on a Thursday night or a Friday night. Sometimes on a Saturday morning, about half an hour or about an hour and a half before it actually has to go to people's inboxes. I've been guilty of that a few times. But it's something that I know I can naturally write. And if you can't be honest about it and find that, once you find that, then don't think about, okay, is it going to make me money? Am I going to get too many listeners or viewers, etc. for the first many episodes? You might do a year, 2 years before you get enough listeners or viewers. You might do about 100, 200. Like I didn't even look at what my listener count was till I was like, what, 60, 70 episodes in, because it didn't strike me that I should look at it. I used to always gauge it by who would respond to me on a LinkedIn and an Instagram, because I'd have someone write in and ask me a question or give me a point of view or give me something they liked about it. And I'm like, oh, people are listening, enough validation for the show I'm doing. But find that level of feedback, find that feedback loop for yourself, find that thing you would love to do. And while you do that, also explore other avenues, and you might find something you enjoy as much. Like for me now, why do I make workout videos? Which is an interesting story, right? So I grew up a scrawny kid. I don't put on weight easily, which people tell me is a blessing, which for me was always like, I'm this, I can very easily become this scrawny person. So I've always tried to put on weight, try to do all that. And at some point decided to be fit because I'm a father, because I wanted to carry Leia around. I want to do all of that. And I just get tired very easily. Because also I quit smoking, 11 years ago now, but I don't think that's still in the system. So I for fun was doing stuff, but I actually make my videos because I enjoy the fact that I'm trying to find the right track for it. And I make everything into a meme. So all my videos are literally me using workouts as a visual for what is a workplace meme. And so that's what keeps me going. I'm doing it not for what do I find as an interesting visual, not necessarily an interesting exercise. I do a lot of other stuff which doesn't look great on camera, so I don't even show them. I'm saying this is fun. This is a great funny meme to go with it. And finally I get to collect enough audio music tracks which I would not normally listen to and use them in these videos. So you will over time find stuff beyond what you normally do focus on. That's because you keep exploring other formats, but don't ignore the prime one which you started with. Let that go and then find other one. So go on that journey. Keep discovering and keep evolving the first one you built out.
This is really great advice, and I'll kind of double down on four of the things you said. Like one, I am a big fan of Ali Abdal as well. In fact, in my podcasting course, I have this slide where I show Ali Abdal, and there's a graph in front of him, which is something that he shared during a video he made when he reached 1 million subscribers. And that graph shows an exponential curve, and he's talking about how when he made 2 videos a week for about half a year. So he had around 50 videos, and when he reached the 50th video, he hit 1,000 subscribers. And I'm just thinking, most young people I know, they're not going to get to video 50 to hit 1,000. The moment they see the numbers aren't high, they are going to drop out. In fact, what is often said about science fiction writers or forecasters is what I think is true of a lot of creators, that they tend to overestimate the short term and underestimate the long term. So they'll create something and they'll think, oh, I'll get so many followers and so many millions or whatever, and that simply isn't true. In fact, Abdal's own sort of advice to young creators in a subsequent video was that if you want to be a YouTube person, make 2 videos a week for 2 years. So that's like 200 videos, and only then see how many subscribers you've got. So it is actually in that sense playing the long game. So the advice number 1, play the long game. Advice number 2 flows from this, which is that do it if you love it. Because if you don't love it, you won't be able to do it. You won't be able to do 2 videos a week for 2 years unless you really care and you're really sort of into it. And that love again comes from authenticity, where you're being true to yourself in everything you do and not trying to copy a Gary Vee or someone else and not trying to fill a niche or whatever. You would do it anyway, and then good things happen, because you do underestimate the long term as well. The third one is iterate endlessly. Like out of the the 2 models that you spoke about, what Tanmay told you about, I really prefer the second model so much, where you're doing something every day, because I think what that model does is that, like, you shouldn't let perfection be the enemy of production, as one of my guests said in a previous episode. If you just do something what makes for excellence? What makes for excellence is iteration. You do something again and again and again, you get better and better at it. Virat Kohli does not become a great batsman by planning how to bat. He plays thousands and tens of thousands of balls in the nets. So you got to do that with whatever format it is you are kind of creating in. And finally, the fourth one, which, perhaps even I should implement in some way, is be open. You might find a groove in doing a particular kind of content, and you might think that, I've got this sorted, I've learned this, abhi yahi karte. But the point is that your content is coming from a particular place, and there are other kinds of content which can come from a particular place. So, just because something is working doesn't mean you should kind of get stuck there. Think about different ways of sort of doing that. And these are things I've, thought a lot about, and I just feel it's important to kind of drive it home to creators, especially the bit about the long game, which I feel is so true. In another of your newsletter editions on December 19th, you in fact wrote about what you call the intimate content ecosystem. And you spoke about how there are like different layers to this. So tell me what you mean by intimate content and what these sort of layers kind of are, because I find that it's a very clear way of sort of giving direction to what a young creator might, then be able to envisage himself doing.
So the whole evolution of how creators even function, right, is that I feel that many times when you look at it from the outside, you look at it, and I think for me it was because I came from advertising and still am. The idea was, okay, you make money off ads. But I feel the real thing is that, and again, this is a learning from Gary Vee, because I think he gives everything away for free. But then as I saw more and more YouTubers and more creators, I realized that some things they would make people pay for. And I said, okay, what do they make people pay for? And I realized that they were all building communities. And they were building different kinds of communities. There is this, I was listening to Pivot, which is my favorite podcast. And I remember that I think between Scott and Careless Whisper, they were saying something and said that every person right now, be it a journalist, be it a content creator, is building multiple channels of distribution. And the more channels of distribution they have, the more stuff they kind of own, right? And that adds back to what the earlier point about trying out newer things is, right? Like imagine every creator who was only putting stuff on TikTok in India suddenly lost all of that. Which is why most of them now are also on Reels, also on Moj and everything else, and Chingari and all the others. So going back to this, I feel that what ends up happening is that there's certain things that people are willing to pay for. But for them to be willing to pay for it, you also have to then kind of build that community of people. So it's layers, right? You have your general audience who's listening to it, happy with that, going ahead. Some people who want to have more interactions, who you then kind of build that community with, where you might give some extra pieces there, and then you'll really find this whole concept of super fans. And I look at super fans as an interesting thing, right? One is when I look at the OnlyFans model, not necessarily even the Patreon model, right? I think OnlyFans has a bad name globally because of its used now as almost a supplement for soft porn. But what it traditionally is the fact that I'm giving you exclusive content for you to pay me something. And what's also happening now with like look at Substack. Substack for me, why I started writing a newsletter was for two reasons. I saw this as an opportunity for me to write again, as something which I've always been wanting to do for the longest time. And secondly, let me put out an audio version of a newsletter, which I thought was interesting to try out. So I thought, okay, it's a private podcast I sent you. It felt so interestingly intimate because that's the word I use. And eventually, at some point, would someone pay for that? I don't know if what I'm writing right now is something to be paid for, but it started off as me experimenting with models which had possible paywalls. I know Twitter's coming up with a model like that. I know everybody will come to that. And eventually you would subscribe to tiers of stuff that you would want from someone who really relate to. And that's actually the way creators will eventually make the most amount of their money. I know the creators already do make a large amount of the money through that. But if you build that system where a set of people are coming to you for a very specific kind of content, and it doesn't have to be 1,000 people or 10,000 people, it could even be 100 people, 50 people, but it's intimate because it's made for you, it is exclusive because this is what you really enjoy and you're going deeper into it, versus the general stuff that you would get which everybody else can get as well. And the ability to do that is something which we finally have because of the internet, because of the creator ecosystem. And that's something which you can always use. So you don't necessarily have to be general entertainment, right? I remember in television, there used to be this thing about the general entertainment channel and the niche channel. Now it's great to be that niche channel because people want niches. So if you are niche, even if you are a person making a movie for Netflix, if you're a niche movie maker, I feel that you might get a deal faster than if you're a massy movie maker. Because they need to fill those gaps of all those niches versus kind of giving them that a big general entertainment thing. So if you have a specific niche and you can go deep into that, get a captive audience, you will find a paying audience. And people are willing to pay for stuff. I feel that we sometimes don't give people enough credit that they would pay for things. I think people will. They just need to see enough value in it. Which is why the broader part, the general part is so important, because that's what gives them that level of trust that them paying you some money will give them something of value. So the general stuff is very important. Then you can drill it down.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. And also the other thing is, in a country like India with, more than 1 billion people, even a niche can be huge.
Yeah.
And for a creator, you don't really need to think of scale like I think of the sort of the two things creators need to take into account as being, reach and revenue. And you need to think about what you're doing for reach and what you're doing for revenue, and, how that kind of balances out. And what I would also say is that, one, when you think of niche, a niche doesn't need to be like an existing niche recognized by everyone else, like say sci-fi is a niche, or this is a niche, or that is a niche. It can just be a niche that you can build around yourself. Like, Kevin Kelly wrote this essay a decade ago about 1,000 true fans, which is a great phrase and which is coming true today on Substack, where his argument was, if you find 1,000 fans who are willing to pay a moderate amount for you, that's enough. You don't need more scale than that. And on Substack, you actually find, where your standard subscription is $100 a year, you get 1,000 people. You are actually sort of doing well enough, and there are tons of creators on Substack who are using that. The other point that I would kind of put out there, as I've discovered from my own experience, is that you don't necessarily need to make something subscription or put it behind a paywall to make people pay for it. Like, even the voluntary model can really work, where if people appreciate certain kinds of content, they'll be kind of perfectly happy to sort of pay voluntarily. Now, I've taken tons of your time. This is already like 3 advertising is dead episodes, just in quantity, not quality, mind you. So I'm going to sort of end with a couple of final questions. So my penultimate question is really about, what do you wake up in the morning looking forward to? Like, one of the benchmarks that I set for myself, the simple question, is that every morning when I wake up, I want to look forward to the rest of the day. So therefore, I want to fill up my tomorrow with something that I know I will look forward to when I wake up in the morning, which doesn't always happen, but I'll just then, maybe order a biryani or something, and that'll do for then. But so what is, and you are obviously someone who, has been reflective, has thought about all of this, has built frameworks, even redefined your podcast just by thinking about it rather than going with the groove that it was going on quite well. So what excites you when you wake up in the morning? What are you looking forward to?
So if you'd asked me this question pre-COVID, my answer would have been a lot simpler. I've always been this enthu person to wake up on a Monday morning really excited about going to work, which people tell me is the most irritating thing to have around you. Because I'm like, yeah, tomorrow's Monday. I'm that person, right? I used to be rather. I still, but now I'm this person who's waking up every morning saying, okay, how many things can I actually do today? I tried writing a journal and I realized I'm terrible at writing a journal because I stopped at one question saying, why do you do what you do? And I feel that it changes every day for me. So I couldn't define that. And I bought this journal by Ryan Holiday, and I couldn't go beyond that page. And I still have, it's been stuck there for like 3 months now. But so I wake up every day saying a set of things I really want to do. And it no longer is one thing. And that's what keeps me excited. Is that in a day, if I only did work for Glitch, or if I only did advertising is dead, or only a newsletter, I would not be a happy person. If in a day I'm doing 5 really different things, 5 different audiences, and I say audiences because, and I speak about this to many people these days, is when my first episode with Ranveer came out for Varun Dugi show, there was a commenter guy who said, even though it's your first podcast, you've done a great job. It's really exciting. I'm waiting for more, right? and I wrote to him. I actually was smiling because I was like, it's great. It's a very different audience, and I have a fresh set of people to kind of get. And so that's what excites me. What excites me every morning is, okay, so much to do. I've also learned to wind down by evening because that at some point gets exhausting. And I have had like weeks where I've just crashed and my brain stops to function. But so, which is why I have a wind down system every night where post 8-9 p.m. I still am doing a ton of stuff. It's just that my pace is slower and I drink turmeric tea, which is my way to wind down.
I messed up your wind down system tonight. Apologies for that.
This has been a wind down.
Right. And okay, so I'll break my final question into 2 because something that you said as usual made further sparks go off, which is that, you're doing multiple things. And what it seems to me is that you were doing a set number of things and those expanded. So you were doing the Glitch, and then you were doing Glitch plus advertising is dead, and then you add newsletter, and then you add the Varun Dugi show, and then you have the working out videos and all of that, and it's expanding. What do you do for, are there any hacks you'd like to share in terms of A, knowledge management, and B, productivity?
My way of knowledge management is that I scribble stuff down. And I used to do it on paper. Now I do it on the phone or the iPad because you lose paper. And that's my thing. So I have a bunch of these snippets, either like screenshots or just like stuff I've written down, which I keep. And I feel that's invaluable because we all believe that ideas will stick in our head, but they come to us in the worst possible time, right? Just when you're going to go to sleep, sometimes when you're half asleep, when you're in the shower. Always note them down. They'll help you in the future. That's how I write my newsletter. Half the time my newsletter stuff is from some random piece, which I wrote a 1 line somewhere and I go back to that. So, and that's how I write every week. So that's really, one way of doing it. The other way is to constantly, I find apps that really help me. I found Readwise, like I mentioned earlier, which keeps that. I found this fabulous app called Next Big Idea, which I think has been one of the revelations of my reading life. Because many times it's not just about finishing a book. I sometimes don't end up finishing books, but sometimes it's also about finding the right books. And Next Big Idea was started by Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, and Daniel Pink, and a few others. They give you a curation of different nonfiction books, and they have the author talk about 5 insights from their book. And if you like the 5 insights, you might, and they give an Amazon link to go buy it. And their subscription also has modes where they'll even send you a couple of books every month, which I haven't done. But I subscribe to this part of it. It lets me kind of get a bunch of ideas for stuff that's happening, people are writing about. It's also made me buy a bunch of those books. But not every book has to be read fully. In many cases, every book, some books you just want to get the main insight out of it. So that's been one big driver. Because for me, I have this need to get as much information about every random thing into my head. But I also realize you only have a certain amount of time. And with a mind like mine, you will zone out of a book very easily. So I don't end up finishing a lot of books. And I tend to try and go back to them over time. And just find different people to follow in the same way, right? So I'm a huge geek culture fan and fanboy of all things Marvel, DC, everything, right? So like I spent 4 hours watching the Snyder Cut. I watched it straight up, and I watched it the next day again because Pooja had only seen 1 hour and she had gone into sleep. And but then after pre that and post that, I'll then run through all the YouTube videos of people discussing smaller nuances, smaller Easter eggs. I'll do that. So which means I've easily spent a good 6 to 8 hours around the Snyder Cut, if not more, in the span of like say a week. But that for me is great information. Like I'll store that somewhere. It'll help in some conversation somewhere. And weirdly enough, those are things I never had to scribble. It's the more serious stuff, which is frameworks or like information or book stuff. You ask me something about a random thing that happened in a Zack Snyder movie, I will remember it verbatim. Like you ask me what happens in a scene in Tridev, I will tell you what happens. So I guess some things never change.
Yeah, and in one of your newsletters, Feb 6th, you spoke about what you called, quote, the balanced information diet, stop quote, where you spoke about how you need to satisfy your heart, your mind, and your belly. So obviously some of the going down rabbit holes, as it were, are, satisfying different aspects of that. And another penultimate question before I get to the final question, because this came out of that, you mentioned somewhere else that, because of being a father, you're consuming a lot of content you wouldn't otherwise. For example, you've seen Frozen many, many times and you absolutely love it. You read her books and all of that. So does that help? That does having this sort of new window into content build a new appreciation and therefore make you a sort of a different person as well, because you're consuming stuff differently and looking at content differently?
Yeah, for sure. I want to do a dad podcast at some point. I will definitely do it.
Oh.
I feel dads don't have information out there, but the stuff I consume with Leia, and I find some of it beautiful. Right? I've discovered some really interesting things because I feel a lot of the books that are available for kids now talk about empathy. They talk about, like, she has a book which the main focus is we're all the same, but we're different, right? And I find the fact that these are books available now, which I don't think we had when we were growing up, right? Which is amazing. So even if we were to talk to her about the color of someone's skin, or to talk to her about some people have privilege and some people don't, at the age where she's 3.5, she's able to understand some of those concepts because of the stuff she consumes. Like even when I look at Frozen, and we've seen it like some 50,000 times, or if not more, in this house. It's a simple thing, right? You're not having, when you talk about love, you're not talking about love just between a man and a woman. You're talking about the love between two sisters. And so just some concepts which you can get out of that. And I think she understands. And she's understood what death is because of Frozen, which I feel is as dark a subject, but because she asked us that will at some point everyone go to the dark sea, which is what Elsa and Anna say her parents have kind of gone to. And so some concepts are understood, and it makes me understand, also makes me understand human beings, right? And how certain pieces kind of come to them, how you can teach. And this side of content for me has really opened up just like the possibilities of how someone as young could be taught concepts which you might feel are very evolved. And you also find some really random stuff. Like there's a book Jimmy Fallon wrote where he was trying to get his daughter's first words, I think daughter or son's first words, to be Papa. And he wrote a fun book where it's basically all the animals saying moo and Papa. So basically, Papa was all over it. Daughter's first words were Mama. But and you also find stuff like that. It's just like a random book. It has nothing in it, but it's so enjoyable. And I get to play with Lego again after a long time. So I'm back to that. So yeah, it's amazing. You suddenly discover different sides of interest.
Which engineer can resist playing with Lego? And that's a lovely quote by you. Dads don't have information. That could be the title of your podcast if you ever do one. Okay, so now my final question, which is that, listeners of the Seen and the Unseen are always asking for recommendations. What should I read? What should I watch? And you, of course, are in a sense an omnivore of great content. But if you had to pick a handful of things, I won't put a number on it, but a handful of things which you feel were life-changing for you or you recommend to everyone, whether they watch it or they read it or whatever, what would they be?
So I've been interested in Stoicism a lot in the last year or two, and Ryan Holiday opened it up for me because he normalized that whole thing. For anyone who's struggling with the way the world is, there's a book called Stillness is the Key. It's a fabulous book. It digs into age-old philosophy, but it's just something which I think for the way the world is right now, with everything that's going on around you, that book has it's helped me. Like I go back to that many times. Stillness is the Key is fabulous to kind of go to. In the other ones that I've read in recent times, I'm just kind of thinking. So if no one's read The Ride of a Lifetime by Bob Iger, right? Again, a fabulous book, just like because I feel arguably one of the best CEOs of this time. And just the fact that, and I was listening to him on Masters of Scale with Reid Hoffman, and it's a two-part conversation. He talks about how you can actually make so many acquisitions as a conglomerate like Disney. I mean, imagine they acquired Marvel, acquired Lucasfilm, and acquired Pixar, but let them still have that identity and that exist as those brands. It's so separate from Disney. So there's so much to learn from his journey and the stuff he's kind of been through. So Ride of a Lifetime on a more business side of things. If I had to recommend a podcast in the last couple of years I've listened to, I'd say two of them. One is the Inside Voice, which I mentioned earlier. There's something called Inside Voice, which is not what this is. I've said this once and someone posted the other one. So I realized there was another one. Inside Voices. It's a headgum podcast. So in case the thing comes in. Fabulous way to kind of dig into the mindsets of podcast hosts. And my favorite fiction-ish podcast in recent times is something called Blockbuster. Season 1 is the story of how George Lucas and Steven Spielberg came up with the blockbuster genre of cinema. Season 2 is James Cameron. I'm not a James Cameron fan, but I love that season because it just made me like him a little bit more than because I didn't like Avatar. That maybe I'm biased in that front of things. So that would be my podcast. In terms of shows, I don't watch as much content as I should on streaming. But if you haven't watched WandaVision, watch WandaVision. I feel it's the riskiest thing anyone can do to make a show like that, considering it was Marvel making it, because every episode is almost like a different genre. And they've imagine taking a Marvel property and making it into a sitcom, which sounds really bizarre. So even people who don't necessarily subscribe to superhero stuff have enjoyed it because it just feels so different. But in a non geek side of things, there's this docuseries with Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine called The Defiant Ones. Arguably one of my favorite docuseries to go back to. I go back to it many times. I think the story is just generally so interesting. I'm not even getting into am I pro Dr. Dre or not, but I think the story of just how that piece worked is just fabulous to look at, and I've always kind of it's one of those places I kind of go back to, and I kind of rewatch it sometimes and can get some nuances from it. So that and this the last one is there's this guys called the Minimalists. They do a podcast. They've done a documentary called Minimalism. They have a YouTube channel as well. They have a new documentary which is on Netflix, which I think is called Less is More, or something like that. As a person who is not a minimalist, and everybody laughs when I say I'm watching something around minimalism because I'm the opposite of it. I'm a hoarder in many ways. I find that the way they talk about it to be so interesting that it makes me want to watch it. And I feel that says something for the fact that someone who is never going to be a minimalist, I know that I'm not going to, but I'm so fascinated by it because of how they speak about it. So I think that's an interesting one to watch.
Well, even if lives aren't minimalistic, frameworks can be. In fact, the best frameworks are the most stripped down and basic ones, I suppose. Varun, thanks so much for gracing me with your presence and giving me so much of your time. No guest has ever given you as much time as you've given me today. So thanks a lot for that.
And thank you so much. It's been fabulous. I never thought I could have actually do this longer conversation on a podcast. So I've finally this is the longest I've ever done an episode. So
great. Thanks a ton. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, head on over to the show notes where I've given a bunch of links about all the things we spoke of, including all of Varun's work. You can also check out his website, varundugi.com, and follow him on Twitter at varundugi. You can follow me on Twitter at Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.